Picture this for a moment. You're sitting in a dusty car park at the end of a brutal 12-hour shift. The desert heat is finally beginning to ease, just barely. There's a paper cup of terrible black coffee going cold in your hand, and your friend leans across the center console, drops his voice to almost nothing, and says 7 words that make every hair on the back of your neck stand straight up. There is a market where souls are sold. That's exactly where this story begins. And I need you to stay with me, because what happened next is one of the strangest, most unsettling things I have ever had the privilege of sharing with you. This account was sent in by a listener named Michael Hassan. Michael works in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, and he wanted to share something he heard directly from a friend whose grandfather was at the very center of this story. Michael has been sitting on this for a long time, and when you hear what he has to say, you'll understand why. So let's go. It was the tail end of a long day somewhere in the sprawling industrial district of Sharjah. The kind of evening where the air still carries a thin film of desert dust, no matter how late it gets. The daylight had bled out of the sky and the darkness was just beginning to press down when Michael found himself in a familiar car park with 2 colleagues he trusted completely. One of them was Bobby, a Nigerian man with a broad laugh and an even broader knowledge of West African occult traditions, secret societies, and things that most people would rather pretend don't exist. The other was Chucks. Now I want you to picture Chucks for a second, because Chucks was not the kind of man who spoke carelessly. He was deliberate, measured. The kind of person who, when he finally said something, you listened, not because he raised his voice, but because his tone made the air around you feel slightly heavier than it had been a moment before. The 3 of them were doing what tired people the world over do at the end of a hard day, sitting, drinking bad coffee, talking about nothing in particular. And then, without any real warning, Chuck set his cup down on the bonnet of the car, looked directly at Michael, and said it. Michael, you listen to a lot of scary stories, but do you know there is a place in this world where people go to fix their poverty and come back as living corpses? Michael told me the exhaustion left him instantly. Just like that. Something in the way Chuck said it, the flatness of it, the complete absence of drama, hit harder than any ghost story Michael had ever heard. He turned to look at his friend properly, and Chuck said 2 words. Spirit market. And here's where things get really dark. The moment those 2 words left Chuck's mouth, Bobby, this man who had spent years studying Nigerian cults, secret brotherhoods, forbidden rituals. Bobby physically recoiled, his body tightened, his eyes went small, and he said, in a voice that had dropped several registers below his usual tone, "Oh yes, the spirit market, where market logic fails and shadow rules don't. Don't go deep into that psychological trap, Chucks. Now, I need you to understand something." Bobby was not a man who frightened easily. This was someone who had spent the better part of his adult life researching some of the darkest corners of West African spiritual tradition. And the name spirit market made him flinch. The car park felt heavier after that. The neon lights overhead suddenly seemed less bright, but Chucks didn't stop. He tilted his head slightly, let a strange little smile sit at the corner of his mouth, and continued. In the deep forest of Casamance, in the Gambia, every 100 years, a market appears. It is not a place that belongs to our world, Michael. It is another dimension entirely. And in that place, money means nothing. You have to trade something else. Something the merchants there actually want. Michael asked the obvious question. What do you trade? And Chucks looked at him for a long moment before answering. What follows is not Michael's imagination. It is not a campfire story down through generations of embellishment. This is the account of real events. Events that took place in the year 2000, in a remote village in the Gambia, as told directly to Michael by Chucks, who heard it from his own grandfather's surviving descendant. A young man named Chucks, who carries his great-grandfather's story the way some people carry old scars, quietly, carefully. Because some things, once you know them, you can never quite unknow. Before I take you into the heart of what happened, I want to give you some context, because this story doesn't make sense without it. South of the Gambia lies a region called Casamance, and if you have never been there, if you only know it from maps and geography lessons, then you need to understand that Casamance is not simply a place. It is something closer to a living presence. The forest there is ancient in a way that goes beyond age. Ancient in the way that certain silences are ancient. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like the absence of sound so much as the presence of something that has chosen not to speak. The Jola people, the indigenous community of that region, have lived alongside this forest for longer than recorded history can account for. And they will tell you, if you ask them and if they trust you enough to answer honestly, that the great silk cotton trees and baobab trees of the deep Casamance are not simply trees. Each one is a home, a residence. And the residents are the Bakian, Powerful spirit entities that have inhabited those ancient trunks since before the first human being set foot in that forest. There are places within the Casamance forest where no birds call, where no insects move, where the air is utterly, completely, unnaturally still, as though the atmosphere itself has been pressed something enormous and invisible that is simply waiting. Local people know these places. They walk around them. They do not enter without reason, and they do not enter without invitation. Chucks, whose family is Jola by heritage, had grown up hearing about one particular phenomenon associated with the deep forest, something the elders called Kambani, the spirit market. According to Jola's spiritual tradition, in the absolute heart of the Casamance forest, in those places where birds do not sing and time itself seems to behave strangely, a market assembles, not every year, not every decade, every 100 years. And it is not a market that belongs to the human world. Chucks explained it to Michael this way, and I'm going to give it to you as closely as I can. In that market, time has no grammar. Our world's days and nights mean nothing there. The clock hands don't turn. The traders there, the spirit merchants, they believe that one moment in their world can equal an entire month in ours, or more. When you cross the boundary into that forest's heart, you might see a raindrop hanging in the air halfway between a leaf and the ground. You might see a flying insect frozen in mid-wing beat. Time in that place is not a river. It is ice. It is perfectly, completely still. And now I want you to think about that for a second. A place where time has stopped, where you could stand between one heartbeat and the next for what feels like hours, where the normal rules of cause and effect simply do not apply. That is where this story takes place. And what happens in the Kambani, the spirit market? Chuck said it plainly. People go there to fix their problems, their poverty, their suffering, their desperation, and the traders, the spirit merchants of the market, they are willing to deal, but they don't want money. They don't want gold or property or any material thing. What they want is something far more valuable, something you cannot replace once you've given it away. Memory, more specifically, the memories that define you, the ones that make you who you are, a childhood, a mother's voice, the feeling of being loved. A man who wants wealth beyond measure might walk into the Kambani and walk out with full pockets. But the price is the happiest memory of his life, stripped clean from his mind forever. A woman who craves power might receive exactly what she asked for, but she pays with her capacity for compassion, for empathy, for love. And the market does not look like a market in any sense you would recognize. Chucks described it this way. There are no wooden stalls or canvas tents. The structures of the Kambani are made of compressed darkness, solid shadow shaped into counters and shelves. On those shelves sit things you would not expect to find in any marketplace. Jars of bottled human size, the scent of someone's first rain, a child's laughter crystallized. And everywhere, that sound, a high-frequency hum, a vibration that sits just at the upper limit of what human ears can process. An unnatural resonance that, Chuck said, most people simply cannot tolerate for more than a few moments. And guarding all of it, standing at the threshold between the human world and the spirit market, is the entity the Jola call Kump. Now here's the thing nobody could explain to me when I first heard this part of the story. Kump is not a person. It is not a masked dancer or a ceremonial figure. Though Chucks acknowledged that human ceremonies do invoke something called Kump, a representation, a shadow of the real thing. The actual Kump of the Casamance is something else entirely. Chucks described it as the accumulated spiritual energy of the forest itself, compressed into a single entity. It has no fixed body. But when it chooses to manifest, it takes the form of a massive, whirling column of leaves and dried vegetation, spinning like a top, like a living tornado. And the force of that spin is not merely physical. It is spiritual. Anyone who crosses the boundary of the sacred forest without permission, without the right spiritual preparation, Kump catches them in that whirl and they become suspended. Frozen, trapped in the market's stop time forever. Not dead, worse than dead. Kump is the law of the spirit market, the order and the judge. If a spirit merchant breaks the rules of the market, if they take more than was agreed, if they harm what they were not authorized to harm, Kump dissolves them into the forest's own fabric. They simply cease to exist as a separate entity and become part of the trees. That is what watches the boundary. That is what two old men, two extraordinary, stubborn, deeply principled old men, had to get past, and they chose to try. The year was 2000. The village was remote even by the standards of rural Gambia, a cluster of mud brick homes and cook fires, and the kind of community that has existed in roughly the same form for centuries. Bound together by shared knowledge, shared history, shared spiritual understanding, Safi was known in that village. Everyone knew Safi. She was a traditional healer, not a sorceress, not a dark practitioner, but a woman with a working knowledge of the plant world and the spirit world that had been passed down through her family. She was also a mother. The kind of mother that villages remember. The kind who would, and did, give everything she had for the welfare of her child. Her son's name was Baka. He was 8 years old. Maybe 9. And by all accounts, Safi would have walked barefoot across broken glass for that child. Which is what made that morning so completely, utterly incomprehensible to everyone who witnessed it. The neighbors heard it first. A sound that pulled people out of their homes in a crowd screaming. Not ordinary crying. Not a tantrum. A sound of absolute, primal agony. When they reached Safi's door and pushed it open, what they found stopped them cold. Safi had her son tied up inside the room, and she was beating him with a heavy piece of timber. Methodically, without hesitation, without any visible emotion on her face whatsoever. Her eyes were not wild. They were not frantic. They were perfectly, chillingly still, like 2 stones dropped into a frozen pond, leaving no ripple. When the neighbors rushed in and grabbed her arms, tried to pull her back, Safi turned on them. And what she said has stayed with every person who heard it for the rest of their lives. I am going to finish this devil today. This is not my child. This is a filthy rat that has crawled into my house. By the time the neighbors managed to restrain her, Baka had several broken bones, multiple fractures, inflicted by his own mother's hands. And here's the thing about Safi that makes this so devastating. This was not an abusive woman. This was not someone with a history of violence or cruelty or instability. 3 days earlier, 3 days, she had been the same Safi she had always been. Warm, attentive, fiercely protective of her son. The village knew her. The village trusted her. And now that same woman was standing in the middle of her compound, bound by neighbors, insisting with perfect calm that the bleeding child on the floor was not her son and never had been. News of what Safi had done moved through the village the way fire moves through dry grass. Within the hour, the community had gathered beneath the great tree at the village center. The palaver tree, the place where serious matters were decided. The alcalo, the village chief, sat at the center, his face closed and grave. Around him, the community pressed in, loud and frightened and angry. She has become a witch. Burn her. She drank her own child's blood. She is possessed. We must cleanse the village. I need you to understand something about the context here, because it matters. In certain traditional communities of that region, particularly among Santalan groups at that time, a person found guilty of witchcraft faced punishment that went beyond imprisonment or exile. The village chief was the local authority. And the community's traditional law was the only law that applied in a place this remote. What was being proposed in that moment, beneath that tree, was Safi's death. She was bound in the center of the gathering. Her hair loose, her body gusted, her body exhausted. But her eyes were still that same terrifying blankness. She kept saying the same thing over and over, in a voice that had no more emotion in it than a stone wall. I have no child. I do not know this crippled piece of rubbish. I have never seen it before. And that was the moment 2 men stepped forward through the crowd. The first man was known throughout that part of the Gambia by a name I'll translate loosely as Pagla, which means something close to, the one who is touched, or the one who sees beyond. He was a traditional spiritual practitioner of considerable reputation, old, lean, with the kind of face that has been weathered by decades of looking at things most people choose not to look at. He wore the loose traditional robe of a Jola healer, and around his neck hung 7 layers of protective amulets, charms that, according to local belief, formed an invisible spiritual shield between him and whatever forces he chose to engage with. The second man was his oldest friend, his counterpart, his shadow in the best possible sense of that word. This man, I'll call him Lala, using the name Chucks gave him, was the physical healer to Pagla's spiritual healer. Where Pagla navigated the unseen world, Lala navigated the body. His hands were legendary in that region. People said, and I mean this was not metaphor, this was sincere belief, that the tips of Lala's fingers contained the healing knowledge of the ancient forest. That when he touched a broken bone, something moved through his hands that had no name in any medical textbook. These 2 men had worked together for decades, and they had never faced anything quite like this. Pagla walked to the center of the gathering and stood directly in front of Safi. He studied her. Not her face, not her body language. He looked into her eyes, specifically into her pupils, because Pagla knew something that the rest of the crowd did not. When you look into a person's eyes, you should see yourself reflected there. A tiny, distorted image of your own face, caught in the moisture of the lens. It's always there. It's one of those small, reliable facts about the physics of the human eye. Safi's pupils had no reflection. None. Where the image of Pagla's face should have been, there was simply depth, a darkness with no bottom. Like looking through a window into a room where all the lights had been extinguished. Pagla turned to the alcalo. Honored chief, what this woman did was unfavorable by the standards of any human heart. I will not dispute that. But what you are calling a witch is something else entirely. Safi's body is standing in front of you. But Safi herself, the Safi you knew, is not inside it. Something has taken her place. Something has moved into the space she left behind. The Alcalo frowned. What are you saying, Pagla? The whole village witnessed what she did to her own child. The boy's bones are broken. What greater evidence of evil do you need? Pagla said, quietly, give me 24 hours. Let me find the Safi who has been lost. If I fail, you carry out whatever sentence your tradition demands. But do not burn an innocent woman's body before you know for certain that the soul inside it is guilty. There was a long silence beneath that tree. The crowd murmured. Several people shouted their objections. But the Alcalo knew Pagla, had known him for years. Trusted him in the way that communities sometimes trust one person, not because of their title or their wealth, but because of their track record. Because of the accumulated weight of things they had done right in the past. The Alcalo raised his hand. The hearing is suspended. 24 hours. The woman remains in Pagla's custody. But if that child dies from his injuries, or if Pagla cannot explain what I cannot explain, then the community's justice will proceed. Pagla turned to Lala, who had been standing just behind him throughout this exchange, absolutely motionless, watching everything. Lala, not a moment to waste. Go home and get your bag. The boy's bones need to be set before the damage becomes permanent. If we don't act in the next few hours, that child will never walk properly again. Lala was already moving. There is something I should explain here about Lala's particular gift, because it is central to what comes next. Along the coast of the Gambia, there is a saying about these two men that Chuck's translated for Michael. Roughly, Pagla knows the language of souls. Lala knows the language of every vein in the human body. Lala's bone setting was not conventional medicine. It was not even conventional traditional medicine. He worked with a combination of forest-derived compounds. The extract of the baobab tree, which local people called the tree of life, specific healing lianas found only in particular parts of the forest, a preparation of dried plants that had been passed down through his own family line for at least 4 generations. Combined with these physical compounds was something else. A technique. A laying on of hands that, according to everyone who had witnessed it over the years, produced results that simply should not have been possible. When Lala arrived at Safi's home and entered the room where Baka lay, the sound the boy was making, that thin, exhausted, beyond tone of someone who has been in pain for so long that the body can no longer produce full sound, stopped Lala in the doorway for just a moment. He set his old leather bag on the floor. He began to rub his palms together. This was something the people who knew him had seen many times, and what those people consistently described was this. After a few moments of sustained friction, a faint warmth would begin to emanate from Lala's hands. Not body heat. Something more concentrated, more directed, as though the hands were generating something the body had no name for. While Lala knelt beside Baka, Pagla stood at the edge of the room and watched. Not the child, but something else. Something in the air around the child. Something Pagla's particular vision allowed him to perceive that other people could not. Pagla said, softly, Lala, his bones, you can fix. But there is a fear in this child that lives deeper than bone. When Safi looked at him with those empty eyes, when she raised that timber, he didn't just feel pain. He looked into his mother's face and saw nothing looking back. That emptiness is eating him from the inside. It will finish him before the bones do. Lala glanced up. His forehead was already damp with effort, though he had only just begun. Then we both have work to do, old friend. Pagla straightened. Meet me at the workshop when you're done here. Tonight I have to go into the sitting position, and before tomorrow morning, I have to be able to tell the chief something that explains what no one in this village can explain. Otherwise, Safi dies, and that boy grows up without a mother. He walked out into the deepening evening. Now, here is where I need to stop and give you something. Because the thing Pagla had deduced, the thing he was beginning to understand about what had happened to Safi, was not something that made any sense within the framework of normal human experience. But within the framework of Jola's spiritual tradition, it made a terrible, coherent, stomach-dropping kind of sense. Safi was not a witch. She was not possessed in the conventional sense. She had not been attacked by a spirit or cursed by a jealous neighbor. What Safi had done, and this is the part that Chucks said made the hair on the back of his neck stand up every single time he thought about it, was something she had done to herself. 3 days before she attacked Baka, Safi had made a choice. A desperate choice driven by whatever it was that had pushed her to the edge. Poverty, perhaps, or illness, or some other pressure that the village account does not specify. She had used a technique that low-level traditional practitioners sometimes knew about, but were almost never prepared to actually attempt. She had separated her soul from her body. She had sent her spiritual self out of her physical form, out of her sleeping body in her home, and directed it toward the Casaman's forest, toward the Kambani, the spirit market. And there, in that place where time stood still and the shadow merchants traded in things that could not be counted or weighed, Safi had made a transaction. She had gone to the market seeking relief from her problems. And the merchant she dealt with had given her something. Some promise, some arrangement, some resolution of whatever it was she was desperate to resolve. In return, the merchant had taken payment in the most literal sense possible. The merchant had taken the memory of her child, not a vague, general softening of maternal feeling, not a gradual forgetting. The specific, complete, total erasure of every memory Safi possessed of Bakaw's existence, birth, his first word, the sound of his laugh, the weight of him in her arms as an infant, the precise quality of his particular kind of love for her, all of it. Gun, which was why, when Safi's soul returned to her body, she looked at the child sleeping in the corner of her home and genuinely, sincerely, completely did not know who he was. She did not experience him as a stranger in the way we experience strangers, with the basic human recognition that this is another human being with their own life and history. She experienced him as an intrusion, an unknown presence in her home, a threat. 3 days of that. 3 days of trying to expel from her home what her mind had categorized as an intruder. And when she could not make him leave, because where would a 9-year-old go? The frustration had curdled into something that ended with broken bones and village gathering beneath a tree debating whether to set her on fire. This was what Pagla had seen in those empty pupils. Not evil, not possession, not witchcraft. A person who had traded away the specific memory of love, and now had no way to remember that she had ever loved at all. That evening, Pagla's workshop was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when they are full of intention. Incense burned from 3 corners. The smoke rose in slow blue spirals, catching the lamplight and dissolving at the ceiling. 2 men sat on woven mats on the opposite sides of a low table, and between them sat a pipe. An old carved wood pipe that had belonged to Pagla's family for longer than anyone could reliably trace. This pipe was not a casual object. It was, in the vocabulary of Jola's spiritual tradition, a focal point. An anchor thing whose accumulated history made it useful in ways that newer objects simply were not. Pagla filled the bowl. Lala took the first draw, and the room filled with a deep, resonant sound. Something between a growl and a purr, as the smoke moved through the carved body of the pipe. He passed it across the table. Pagla took a long, slow pull, held it, released. And when he spoke through the dissolving smoke, his voice had settled into a register that suggested he was already half somewhere else. Lala. What the Elder Spirit told me earlier tonight. I believe it. The Kanbani is accessible for what remains of this window. In their time, a few moments have passed since Safi made her trade. The merchant's hands are still warm from the transaction. There may still be time. Lala looked at his friend through the haze of the smoke. But getting past Kump is not a minor obstacle, Pagla. Kump doesn't simply step aside because the cause is just... No, Pagla agreed, it doesn't. But I believe Kump will not stop us. And I'll tell you why. He leaned forward. Our ancestors knew how to move the soul without losing the body. The astral anchor technique. The tethering method. We send ourselves in. But we stay connected to our physical forms by a spiritual cord. If we meet danger that we cannot overcome, we can withdraw before the cord is severed. We will be shadows in their world, not souls at large. Tethered shadows. Lala set the pipe down. He understood what Pagla was proposing, and he understood the implications precisely. The astral anchor, what Pagla was calling the tethering method, was the highest level technique known to Jola spiritual practitioners of their generation. It meant separating consciousness from the physical body while maintaining a continuous energetic connection, like an umbilical cord made of concentrated intention. The body would remain here, in this room, breathing and alive. The spiritual selves would travel, and if the worst happened, if the spirit merchants of the Kambani detected their presence and moved to trap them, the cord would give them a path back, but only if they moved quickly enough. If we lose the cord, La bodies will be alive but empty, like Safi. Safi, yes, said Pagla simply. Like Safi, a long silence. Then Lala straightened his back, picked up the pipe one more time, took a single slow breath, and said, then we shouldn't waste time talking about it. That night, Pagla's wife, a woman I'll call Eleanor, using an equivalent name, remained in the workshop with Safi and Baka while the 2 old men withdrew to the inner room. Eleanor was not merely a domestic figure in this household. She had shared decades of this life with her husband. She had witnessed things that would have broken most people's capacity for equanimity entirely. She knew what the 2 men were about to attempt, and she knew her role. From a stone mortar in the corner of the outer room, she began preparing a compound she had made many times before, a paste derived from a rare aquatic plant that grew only at the edges of deep water pools. The Jola called it the blue gripper, a plant believed to repel malignant spiritual forces and, crucially, to anchor a compromised soul more firmly to its physical housing. She ground it slowly, deliberately, until the paste was dense and aromatic. Then she went to where Safi sat, blank-eyed, still like a figure carved from stone, and applied the paste in a careful line across Safi's forehead. The moment the compound touched Safi's skin, something happened that Eleanor had not fully expected, even knowing the plant's properties. Safi's body shuddered. A deep, involuntary tremor that moved through her from shoulders to knees, and the temperature of her forehead, which had been burning hot with whatever energy was sustaining that terrible blankness, dropped. Rapidly. Within seconds, the skin beneath Eleanor's fingers was cool as river water. Eleanor leaned close to Safi's ear and said very quietly, "While that mark is on your forehead, none of the market's shadow traders can reach you. Here, you are anchor your husband and his friend are going to do tonight. They are doing for you. Stay still. Stay here. Don't fight it." She did not know if Safi heard her. There was no visible response. But Eleanor had done this before, spoken to the empty housing of a person while their essential self was elsewhere, and she believed in the bone, deep way that comes from decades of wisdom, things that defy easy categorization, that some part of Safi registered the words. In the inner room, the two old men lay on mats placed parallel to each other, close enough that if either of them reached out a hand, they could have touched. The incense there was heavier, a combination of compounds that Pagla had prepared specifically for this kind of work. The smoke moved strangely in that room, not drifting upward as smoke normally does, but curling inward, rotating slowly around the two still forms like something deliberate. Pagla began the recitation first, low, rhythmic. The words were old. Old in the way that certain sounds are old, carrying the resonance of generations of repeated use. Lala joined them on the second repetition, their voices braiding together in a pattern that was not quite call and response but something close. Gradually, the breathing of both men slowed. Their chests rose and fell at intervals that were too long, too deliberate, to be ordinary sleep. Their faces settled into the particular stillness of people who have gone somewhere their bodies cannot follow. And from that stillness, from those two motionless bodies lying on woven mats in a smoky room in a remote Gambian village, two shadows detached themselves from the physical world and began to move. The Casamance forest at night is something that language struggles with. When the two astral forms of Pagla and Lala arrived at the boundary of the sacred forest, the specific threshold beyond which the rules of the ordinary world ceased to apply, what they encountered was not darkness in any conventional sense. It was the absence of movement, the profound absolute stillness of a world on pause. A moth hung in the air between two trees, its wings spread mid-flutter, frozen there, impossibly balanced, as though someone had reached into the fabric of physical law and simply pressed stop. A raindrop that had been falling from a leaf hung perhaps 8 inches above the ground, motionless, suspended in a moment that had been stretched far beyond its natural duration. No wind, no insect sound, no rustle of leaf or crack of twig, nothing. And then, as the two shadow selves moved toward the forest boundary, the sound arrived. It came from somewhere deep inside the tree line. A rotating, accelerating sound, dry as grinding bone, like thousands of dead leaves being compressed and spun simultaneously. It built in seconds from a whisper to a roar, and from the interior of the forest, visible even in the darkness through some quality of its own light, or anti-light, something emerged. A column. A whirling column of compressed dried vegetation, of leaf fragments and stem pieces and forest debris, spinning at a velocity that made the eye blur attempting to track it. Enormous. Taller than any of the trees it had come from. Moving with a directed, purposeful energy that made it absolutely clear this was not a natural phenomenon. Cump. The entity moved directly toward the two shadow selves and stopped. Stopped with a precision that felt deliberate, that felt considered, approximately an arm's length away. And from inside the whirling column, a voice emerged. Not the voice of a human being. Not the voice of anything that had ever drawn breath in the ordinary world. Something older. Something that vibrated at a frequency the bones registered before the ears did. By whose permission have you crossed this boundary? Every particle of dust in this forest is under my watch. Do you not know that the price of entering here without invitation is permanent death? And here's the thing nobody could explain to people who heard this story afterward. Pagla, an old man in the physical world, lying motionless on a mat in a room miles from this forest, did not hesitate. His astral form had no body to make tremble, no throat to go dry. What it had was 70 years of accumulated conviction, and he spoke with every grain of it. Great Cump, guardian of the Casamance, keeper of this boundary since before our grandfathers' grandfathers walked this earth. We have not come for personal gain. We have not come seeking power or wealth or trade. We have come for Mother, a woman who, in her desperation, made a transaction in the Kambani that she did not fully understand. In that market, she traded the memories of her child. And now she does not know him. Her hands have broken his bones. The village is ready to kill her for it. We have come to take back what was taken from her. Not to steal, not to cheat, but to restore what should never have been sold. If justice is your nature, then clear our path. The column was still for a long moment. The spinning slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. and from within it, 2 points of light, something like eyes, something like concentrated awareness. Studied the two shadow forms with an attention that felt like being turned over in enormous hands. The voice, when it came again, had changed slightly. Not warm, not welcoming, but marginally less like the sound of a mountain deciding whether to fall on you. The Kanbani does not easily give back what it has taken. The shadow merchants do not release their acquisitions. But your souls carry no corruption. Your intention is singular. I will do this. I will wrap your forms in a concealing mist, so that the merchants cannot read your true nature or your true purpose. You will enter the market as shadows among shadows. But hear me, if they detect you, if they see through the concealment before you have withdrawn, your shadow selves will become images. Permanent images fixed to the walls of that market for eternity. And your bodies, back in that room, will be breathing corpses. Forever. The whirling column emitted a single concentrated exhalation, not breath, but something that functioned like breath, and the two shadow forms felt it pass through them. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Cold in the way that absolute clarity is sometimes cold. And when the feeling passed, they looked at each other and understood without words that they were no longer visible to whatever would be watching inside the market. They had been wrapped in something that made them indistinguishable from the market's own inhabitants. Kump withdrew back into the tree line, and the path into the Kanbani was open. Stepping into the spirit market was, according to what Chucks relayed to Michael, unlike any other experience in Pagla and Lala's combined centuries of spiritual practice. The weightlessness was the first thing. Shadows in a shadow world have no physical mass, and the absence of that familiar heaviness, the absence of a body's gravity, was disorienting in a way that was difficult to compensate for. The second thing was the market itself. It was vast. Far larger inside than any external impression could have suggested. The stalls, those compressed darkness structures, stretched in every direction, into a gray haze that had no visible endpoint. Everything was mock on gray, brown gray, black on gray. The only variation in the palette came from what was on display, and those things glowed, faintly, each in its own specific color. The color of what it had once been before it was extracted. On one counter, barely visible within a sealed container. Something that pulsed with a greenish warmth, like the memory of a summer afternoon. On another, a cold blue shimmer that might have been the specific sensation of hearing your name called by someone who loved you. Things without bodies, things without shape, things that had been pulled out of human beings while those human beings were still alive and dreaming. And the merchants, moving between the stalls in that soundless, purposeless, seeming way of entities that have been doing the same thing for so long that the motion has become entirely automatic. They had no defined forms. They were thicker air, darker patches of the surrounding gray. Hands that extended from no visible body. Hands with fingers like extruded wire, like something spun rather than grown, moving constantly through the air around their wares as though reading them by touch alone. At the center of the market, on a raised platform constructed from the exposed root system of some enormous, ancient tree, a tree that did not exist in the physical Castleman's forest, or perhaps existed there as something far less visible, sat the largest of these entities. No face, no describable form. Just a concentration of darkness wearing the suggestion of a cloak, from beneath which those long wire fingers extended and moved and moved and moved. Pagla's shadow self looked at Lala's shadow self, and Lala looked back. And then, from the body lying on the mat in that room miles away, from the physical form of Pagla, motionless and sweating and utterly committed, the recitation began. It entered the spirit market the way a current enters water. Not a sound. Sound did not function normally in the Kanbani, but as vibration. As a frequency that the shadow selves of Pagla and Lala felt moving through the very substance of what they were. The words of the recitation, shaped by 70 years of practice, translated into the astral register and hit the market's stillness like a storm dropped into glass. And in the market, Pagla's shadow form began to do what Pagla had planned. He created a mirage. It is perhaps the most difficult thing to explain in this entire story, but Chucks tried to explain it to Michael, and Michael tried to explain it to me. And I'll try to give it to you as faithfully as I can. A human mind that has spent decades navigating the space between the physical world and the spirit world accumulates a particular skill. It learns to generate images. Not hallucinations, not illusions, but functional constructs that exist in the astral register with the same solidity that buildings exist in the physical register. Pagla had been building these skills for his entire adult life, and what he constructed now, in the heart of the spirit market while Lala moved toward the shelves, was a perfect, persuasive, utterly compelling false reality. What the shadow merchants saw, in the space where Pagla's shadow form was standing, was exactly what they expected to see. Another shadow, another wandering presence in the market, purchasing, browsing, entirely unremarkable. The mirage was flawless because it was built from the very vocabulary of the market itself. From the darkness and the gray and the wire, fingered quality that the Kambani ran on. The merchants saw their own world reflected back at them. They saw nothing that was not already there. The central entity, the one on the root platform, the largest and most dangerous presence in the market, felt the vibration of Pagla's recitation touching its awareness and interpreted it as part of the mirage, part of the show. It reached its wire fingers toward the construct and found itself moving through a labyrinth of reflected images, each one leading to another, each one convincing in the moment and dissolving on contact. It was not deceived in any permanent sense. But it was occupied, slowed, its attention fractured across a dozen false impressions simultaneously, which was exactly what Lala needed. Lala's shadow self moved through the stalls with the focused efficiency of a healer who has worked under time pressure for 50 years. His particular gift, the ability to perceive the energetic signature of living things rather than their surface appearance. Translated into the astral register as a form of reading, he could sense, from among the hundreds or thousands of bottled and shelved memories in that market, which ones had recently arrived, which ones still carried the warmth of a living person's presence, which ones had been taken not weeks or months ago, but days. He moved through aisle after aisle of compressed darkness and displayed fragments of human experience. And then he found it, a shelf at the back of a secondary stall, low down, partially by the energy of two larger acquisitions above it, a small dense swirl of something blue-gray, a compressed spiral that rotated slowly, maintained by whatever force the market used to preserve its wares. And inside that rotating spiral, barely visible, flickering like a candle flame in a draught, the image of a child's face, Baka's face. Lala did not reach for it immediately. He studied it first. Around the spiral, coiled loosely but present, were several strands of what he recognized as Ninkinanka energy, the spirit residue that market entities used to mark their acquisitions to make clear that this item had been properly transacted and thus now the market's property. Moving the spiral without addressing those strands would trigger an alarm, would shatter the mirage, would end everything. But from the body in that distant room, the recitation was still building. The vibration in the market was still intensifying, and Lala felt it. Felt the increasing force of what Pagla was generating that astral cord, as a warmth in his shadow hands. A warmth that grew and grew until it was something almost physical, something almost real. He extended his hands, cupped them, directed the warmth of the recitation's energy toward the Ninkinanka strands. The strands dissolved, not gradually, instantly, as though they had never been there. As though the market's claim on what they secured had simply ceased, had been outweighed by something older and more fundamental and altogether less negotiable. Lala took the spiral. He pressed it into the center of his shadow form, against whatever served as his chest, and felt it integrate. Felt it join with him, temporarily, a memory lodged inside a vessel that was not its original home, but would do until it could be returned to where it belonged. He turned. He looked across the market at Pagla's shadow form, met what functioned as eyes, and communicated in the way that people who work together for 50 years communicate, not with words, not with gestures, but with the simple fact of the look itself. Now, the central entity felt it the moment Lala turned. Not the theft itself, that had been masked too well, but the shift in the market's energetic balance, the sudden absence of a weight it had been carrying. The merchant self-turned from Pagla's mirage, which was already beginning to thin, already beginning to show its seams as the recitation's energy redirected toward the withdrawal, and swept its wire, fingered awareness across the stalls. The wail it produced was not sound. It was a disruption, a tearing of the market's fundamental stillness that sent shockwaves through every structure in the Kambani. Stalls shuddered. Containers rattled on their shelves. The gray atmosphere thickened to the consistency of fog and then thickened further to something approaching liquid. From his shadow position, Pagla heard Lala's silent alarm and responded with the last thing in his arsenal. Not a mirage this time, not a construct, something he had never used before and would never use again. A focused projection of every grain of accumulated spiritual force he possessed, directed not at the merchant but at the market itself, at the stopped, time fabric of the Kambani. For approximately 3 seconds, that fabric cracked. In those 3 seconds, the stop time of the spirit market, its greatest power, the thing that made it impossible to escape from once you were truly caught inside it, stuttered, flickered, reset. In those 3 seconds, the merchant's wire finger awareness was occupied with nothing but re-establishing the market's integrity. And in those 3 seconds, 2 shadow selves pulled the astral cord and followed it home. The sound that came from Pagla's workroom was what Eleanor heard first. A sound like 2 people simultaneously inhaling for the first time after being held underwater for far too long. A desperate, grasping, full body return to breath. She was in the outer room instantly, and what she saw when she pushed open the inner door was this. Two old men, sitting bolt upright on their mats, drenched in sweat, completely wide awake, staring at each other with the particular expression of people who have just survived something they are not entirely sure they survived. Pagla looked at Lala. Lala looked at Pagla. Then Lala opened his hand, and in the hollow of his shadow palm, fading now, becoming less visible in the physical world's light, the blue, gray spiral flickered. He looked at Eleanor. "Where is Safi?" The rest happened quickly, because everything that had happened in the spirit world had taken far longer in the physical one. 2 nights and most of 2 days, in fact, which left them hours, not days, before the Alkalo's deadline expired. Lala moved to where Safi sat in the outer room, still with Eleanor's protective paste on her forehead, still in that terrible empty stillness. He held his hand, the hand that had carried the spiral from the market, against the side of Safi's head, against the temple, and he spoke words that Chucks could not fully relay to Michael because they were in a register of Jola that very few living people had any access to. What happened next is what every person present in that room that morning described consistently, regardless of who asked them about it later. Safi's body, which had been rigidly still for the better part of 3 days, began to shake. Not a tremor, a deep, full body shuddering, the kind that happens when something long frozen begins to thaw. The temperature of her skin changed. Her eyes, which had been that terrible blankness, began to track, to move, to search the room for something they had been unable to find for 72 hours. And then Safi found what her eyes had been looking for. Bakal was in the corner. His injuries were bound. Lala had set the bones the first night, but he was awake, watching his mother with eyes that understood, at 9 years old, far more than any child should ever have to understand. He had watched his mother become a stranger. He had spent 3 days trying to understand why the person to why most in the world had looked at him as though he were something to be removed. He was not prepared for the sound his mother made when she saw him. It was not a word. It was not language. It was the sound of a person finding something they had been convinced was permanently lost. A sound that came from somewhere below the chest, below the throat, from somewhere in the architecture of the body that does not usually get to speak. Safi crossed the room on her knees. She gathered her son against her chest with the desperation of someone who has been underwater and has just broken the surface. She held him with the kind of specific, particular force that comes from the specific, particular love of a mother who knows, now that she can remember, exactly what she came within hours of losing. Both of them, the child she had hurt, and herself. Pagla stood in the doorway and watched, and Lala stood beside him. And after a moment, Lala put one hand briefly on Pagla's shoulder, a gesture that required no explanation and received none. Eleanor, from somewhere behind both of them, very quietly began to cry. The village meeting that morning was brief by comparison with what it might have been. The Alcalo sat beneath the great tree and heard what Pagla told him. He heard it without interrupting, without challenging. He had known Pagla long enough to know when a man was telling him the truth, and when a man was constructing a narrative for his own benefit. This was truth. He could hear it in the quality of Pagla's exhaustion, the bone, deep, fathomless tiredness of a man who has been somewhere that cost him something real. When Pagla finished, the Alcalo looked out at the assembled village. He said what was done to that child was a harm, a serious harm, and the woman who did it will live the rest of her life with what her hands were capable of when she was not herself. That is not nothing. That is a weight she will carry until she dies. But this village will not add to it. The case is closed. There were ejections. There always are. But the Alcalo had made his decision, and in that community, at that time, the Alcalo's decision was the end of the matter. Safi left the tree, meeting with her arm around Bakaw's shoulders, walking slowly because his legs were still healing, but walking. Together. Michael told me that when Chucks finished telling the story in that car park in Sharjah, with the neon lights overhead and the desert cooling around them and Bobby sitting very still and very quiet in the third seat, there was a long silence. Then Bobby said, quietly, remember one thing, people. Money is available to almost everyone, but only a few have friends like Pagla and Lala. Michael looked out at the car park, at the ordinary fluorescent lit, entirely unsupernatural world around them, and said nothing. Because there was nothing adequate to say. There's one last thing I want you to sit with. Safi went to the spirit market because she was desperate, because whatever she was carrying had pushed her to a point to risk the most extreme transaction imaginable. We don't know exactly what drove her there. The story doesn't tell us that, and perhaps that's right. Perhaps that's not the point. The point is that she traded the memory of her child because she thought she had no other option. And the market took that memory with complete willingness, because that is exactly what the market is designed to do. It finds the thing and is most precious to you, and it makes it available for trade. It finds the love you are most afraid of losing, and it offers you a receipt. Two old men went into that market and brought it back. Not because they were required to. Not because it was their responsibility. Because they chose to. Because the alternative, watching an innocent woman burn while her child grew up without her, was simply not something they were willing to accept. I need you to understand, these people had no reason to lie. The story has too many witnesses, too many consistent details, too many independently verifiable specifics for the alternative explanation to hold water. Something happened in the Gambia in the year 2000. Something that needs neatly into any category I know how to offer you. And somewhere in the deep Casamance forest, in a place where time stands still and moths hang frozen in the air and the rain refuses to fall, there is a market. And it is always, always open for business. There is a particular kind of evil that doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It doesn't arrive wearing a mask or carrying a sign. It arrives wearing the face of ambition, of desire, of a young man who simply wants more than he was given, and is willing to pay any price to get it, even a price that isn't his to pay. This next story was sent in by a listener named Oliver Islam, and Oliver wanted me to share something he collected from a 100-year-old man in his community, a man who had lived long enough to remember a time when the world worked by different rules. When certain people held power over their neighbors not through law or wealth alone, but through something far older and far darker. And when that power was pursued carelessly, when someone reached for it without understanding what reaching for it truly cost. The consequences had a way of falling on people who never asked to be part of the transaction at all. I want to be transparent with you, as I always try to be. All Erase a Cat has a gap in it. A moment near the end where something in the telling becomes unclear. I'll flag it when we get there. But the core of what happened, the events that Oliver documented from this elderly source, is chilling enough that I don't think the gap diminishes it in any meaningful way. This story takes place in the pre-war American South, in the era of plantation estates and the brutal hierarchies they produced. In a time and place where certain families held absolute authority over the communities around them. Not merely economic authority, but something closer to feudal dominion. The kind of authority that had no meaningful check on it, no appeal process, no oversight. Into that world, this story was born. The estate was large by the standards of the region. The kind of property that announced itself through its own scale. The long approach, the grand architecture, the carefully maintained grounds that communicated, without needing to say a single word, exactly where power resided and exactly who held it. The family that owned had held it for generations. And like many such families, they had convinced themselves, over the accumulation of those generations, that the rules governing ordinary people simply did not apply to them. The eldest son of this family, I'll call him Edmund, though that was not his name, had grown up inside that conviction. He had inherited it the way he inherited everything else. Along with the estate, along with the wealth. Along with the assumption that what he wanted, he would have, and that the distance between wanting and having was largely a matter of applying sufficient pressure. Edmund was not, by the accounts available to us, stupid. He was educated, in the way that wealthy young men of that era were educated, selectively narrowly, in directions that served the maintenance of his family's position, rather than any genuine broadening of his understanding. He could read, he could manage accounts, he could present himself in society with a reasonably convincing simulation of refinement. But beneath all of that, there was a hunger in Edmund that conventional acquisition could not satisfy. A hunger for something beyond what money and property could provide. Something that would give him an edge, not merely over his economic contemporaries, but over the world itself. Over the ordinary, frustrating, resistant reality that sometimes, even for men of his position, refused to simply bend to what he wanted. What Edmund wanted was what he called the dark arts. What we might call, more plainly, black magic. Living at the edge of the estate's territory was a man who was known in the surrounding community as a practitioner. Not a charlatan, not a showman, a genuine, deeply knowledgeable practitioner of spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage, had survived slavery, had survived every attempt to eradicate them, and had emerged intact, adapted, and formidably powerful. This man had a reputation that extended far beyond the immediate neighborhood. People came to him from considerable distances with problems they could not solve through ordinary means. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had earned his position through decades of discipline and sacrifice. A man who understood, with the clarity that only genuine practitioners develop, that the knowledge he held was not neutral, that it came with obligations, that it could not be passed to someone unprepared to handle it without causing damage. Damage to others, damage to the world, damage that the teacher would share responsibility for. Which is why when Edmund sent word through intermediaries that he wished to study under this practitioner, the answer was no. The answer was no politely at first, then more firmly. The practitioner gave his reasons that were, in fact, sound and principled. This was not the kind of knowledge that could be safely transmitted to someone with Edmund's particular combination of temperament, privilege, and absence of any real spiritual foundation. The consequences of doing so would be unpredictable and very likely severe. Edmund did not take no well. Men of his background rarely did. He had the practitioner brought to the estate, and when the man arrived, voluntarily, because refusing the summons of someone with Edmund's social power in that era was not really an option, Edmund made his request again, directly, man to man, with the full weight of his position behind every word. The practitioner refused again, and here's where things get really dark. Edmund ordered his men to hold the practitioner. And then Edmund, a man who had never been told no by anyone who could not be overruled, picked up a container of boiling oil from the kitchen and threw it. I'm not going to dwell on what that means physically. I think you understand. What I want you to understand is the choice that the practitioner faced in that moment. A man of genuine principle, of genuine spiritual knowledge, of genuine commitment to using that knowledge responsibly. That man, in that moment, was being tortured into doing the one thing his principles had told him he must not do. And he had to make a decision. He agreed to teach Edmund, not because his principles had changed, not because he had suddenly concluded that Edmund was a suitable student, but because continuing to refuse, in that moment, in that place, with those men holding him, was simply not survivable. And a dead teacher passes on no wisdom at all to anyone. So the teaching began. Now I want you to think about that for a second, because there is something deeply important in what follows that only makes sense if you hold on to this context. The practitioner taught Edmund, carefully, selectively. He gave him techniques that worked, because a completely false education would have been detected quickly, and the consequences of that detection were not something the practitioner was in a position to survive. He taught Edmund real things. But he taught them in an order, and with an incompleteness, that left the most dangerous applications accessible without the safeguards that a genuine student would have learned first. Edmund did not know this. Edmund was not equipped to know this. Edmund was not equipped to start with. He was taught with the enthusiasm of someone who had always assumed that the universe was simply waiting to give him whatever he wanted, and who now had confirmation of this belief in the most satisfying possible form. He learned. He practiced. He became within his limited framework capable. And then he saw the girl. She was from a family of potters, craftspeople who worked clay into vessels, who had been doing so for generations, whose knowledge of materials and form had its own kind of integrity and beauty. Her name is not recorded in any way that Oliver's source could access, so I'll call her Clara. And Clara was, by the account of everyone who knew her, a woman of considerable grace. Not merely physical beauty, though that too, but the kind of quality that comes from a person who is genuinely settled in themselves, who knows who they are, who moves through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who does not need anyone else's validation to feel complete. Edmund saw her during one of his rides through the territory. He stopped. He looked. And in the way of men like Edmund, men for whom the distance between wanting having had been systematically erased by every experience of their adult lives, he decided. He approached her. He told her what he wanted. She walked away. Edmund was not accustomed to being walked away from. The feeling it produced in him was not one he had any framework for processing constructively. It became, instead, a fixation. And fixation, in a man with Edmund's particular combination of resources and newly acquired knowledge, was a genuinely dangerous thing. He went to the practitioner. He told him what had happened. He told him what he wanted. And he asked, with the full implication it would have that the last time the practitioner declined a request for a technique that would accomplish it. The practitioner, who had been waiting for something like this, gave Edmund what he asked for. Specifically, he told Edmund that the ritual required 4 black doves. That those doves, once the working was complete, needed to be buried alive at the intersection of 2 graves, a paired burial site, 2 bodies in proximity, while the working's effects were still active. And that once this was done, Edmund needed to go to Clara and strike her across the face. I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking right now. But I need you to understand something about the mechanics of what the practitioner described, because it matters for what comes later. The strike was not the instrument of harm. It was the instrument of transmission, a physical point of contact through which the working's influence was meant to pass from the prepared ritual space into the specific person it was directed toward. Edmund did not question the ethics of any of this. He gathered the doves, he performed the burial, he went to Clara, and he struck her. What happened next is the part of the story that Oliver's underly source described with the particular weight of someone who had seen it, or heard it from someone who had seen it, and never quite managed to put it down afterward. Clara turned around, and she asked Edmund to marry her, not under duress, not with the expression of someone who had been frightened into compliance. with what appeared, from the outside, to be genuine desire, willingness, interest. The working had done precisely what Edmund intended it to do. Edmund took her home. He presented her to his family. His family's response was exactly what you would expect from a family of that background in that era, confronted with the idea of their son and heir forming any kind of permanent attachment to a woman of Clara's social position. The answer was absolute. Unequivocal. Clara would leave. She would not be received in this house. She was not acceptable. Edmund, for once in his life, held a position that contradicted his family's wishes and did not retreat from it. He took Clara and left the estate. He relocated them both to a property he controlled independently, a modest house in a rural area at some distance from his family's seat, far enough from his previous life to establish something new. Something that was, on the surface at least, his own. They built a life there. It was not comfortable by the standards Edmund had grown up with. He worked. Clara worked, returning to the craft she knew, making pottery, which turned out to be more economically viable than Edmund's various other attempts at income. Within a few years, by the account of the elderly source, they had accumulated something real, a functioning household, actual savings, the outward shape of stability. But there was a problem. The house sat on a natural depression in the land, an area where, over years of Clara's work with clay and water and earth, a large pit had formed behind the property. They decided to make it useful. They commissioned the digging of a proper pond, a water source that would reduce the considerable inconvenience of hauling water from a distance. The digging was completed. The pond was well constructed. The drainage was correct. The positioning made sense in every practical way. A year passed. The pond held no water. Not a diminished amount, not a disappointing trickle. Nothing. The pond sat behind their house, perfectly formed, correctly positioned, and completely, persistently, inexplicably dry. Edmund watched it. He had his workers check the soil composition, the underlying geology, the drainage patterns. Nobody could explain why a pond of that depth, in that location, with that construction, refused to fill. And then Edmund made the decision that defines this story. The decision that takes everything that came before it and renders it a prelude. He decided to use what he knew. A black goat. Purchased at market. Brought home on a specific night. A night chosen, according to the practitioner's earlier instruction, according to the positioning of certain celestial markers. At midnight, in the field behind the house, Edmund performed what the practitioner had called a summoning work. The goat was slaughtered. Its blood was used to construct a specific configuration on the ground. A pattern that, within the tradition Edmund had been partially taught, functioned as an invitation. A formal request for the presence of particular entities. Clara smelled it before she saw anything. A smell that she later described, and that Oliver's source relayed with the careful precision of someone repeating a vivid account, as something between rotting vegetation and something else entirely. Something that had no natural analog. Something that should not have been inside a house. She came to Edmund and told him, as she had told him before and as she told him now with increased urgency, that whatever he was doing needed to stop. That the things he was practicing were not things that could be practiced without cost. That the cost would come. That she could feel it coming in the quality of the air around their home, in the quality of the silence at night, in things she could not fully articulate, but could absolutely not dismiss. Edmund did not stop. The entities came. Oliver's source described this part simply, not elaborately, not with theatrical detail, but with the flatness of someone reporting a fact. They were there. Multiple presences, powerful ones, filling the space where the ritual had been conducted with a quality of attention that was entirely unlike any human attention. The smell intensified to the point where it reached every corner of the house. Edmund asked his question. The entities answered. And here is where the story takes its darkest turn. The answer. The solution offered by these entities to the question of why the pond would not fill and how to make it fill was this: a bride. A new bride on her wedding night, brought to the pond and offered there. I need you to understand what Edmund did with this information. Because I think the thing that makes this story truly disturbing is not the supernatural element. It's the speed, the absence of any meaningful internal resistance, the complete lack of any moment in which Edmund appears to have seriously considered the human cost of what he was being asked to do. He began looking for a candidate almost immediately. He found a man of very limited means, struggling with the specific kind of poverty that leaves a person without good options in any direction. Edmund approached this man with a proposition. He wanted to marry the man's daughter. He would pay, well, by the standards of what this man was accustomed to. There was one condition. After the marriage, the man would not see his daughter again. Contact would not be possible. The man, and I want to be careful here not to simply condemn him, because desperation does things to decision, making that comfortable to find difficult to fully understand. Agreed. The money was real. The alternative was continuing poverty with no clear path out of it. He agreed. And he did not know, because he could not have known what he was agreeing to. The wedding preparations moved forward. A date was set. The ceremony took place. On the morning after the wedding, before the sun had risen properly, in the specific quality of darkness that sits between the last of night and the first of day, Edmund brought his new wife to the pond. He told her it was a tradition that new brides in this household always performed a dawn ritual at the water's edge. The young woman was frightened. She had not chosen this, had been married to a stranger under circumstances she had not fully consented to, and now was being brought to a large, dark, empty pit in the pre-dawn darkness by a man she did not know. She refused. Edmund insisted, pressured, applied the particular kind of weight that someone in his position could apply to someone in hers. And eventually, because she had no practical alternative, she went. He led her to the center of the dry pond floor. He retrieved the remains of the slaughtered goat, the hide and the skull, and threw them into the pond around her. He performed the final stage of the ritual. He spoke the words the entities had given him. He made the offering they had requested. He climbed out of the pond. She did not. Oliver's source was clear that what happened next was not metaphorical, not exaggerated, not the kind of embellishment that accumulates around old stovers over time. The pond filled, rapidly, with water that appeared to come from nowhere, from no rain, from no underground source that had previously shown any sign of activity. The pond filled. And the young woman who had been standing in the center of it did not have time to reach the edge. Edmund stood at the rim and watched. And here is what the 100-year-old source told Oliver, in the flat and specific tone of someone who is not trying to make you feel anything in particular, but simply telling you what was true. Edmund walked back to his house. He went to breakfast. He went about his day. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Not the supernatural element. The other part, a man who was educated, who was capable of love, or at least of the sustained fixation that shared some of love's external characteristics, who had built a functioning life with Clara, had worked, had struggled, had achieved something real with her. That man stood at the edge of a pond and watched a young woman drown. And then he had breakfast. The pond, Oliver's source confirmed, is still there. Still filled, still sitting behind what was once that property. Local knowledge of it persists in the community, as local knowledge of these things tends to persist, passed from generation to generation in the way that warnings get passed. Don't go near that pond. Don't fish in it. Don't let children play at its edge, because something was given to fill it that should never have been given. And what was given doesn't go away just because the man who gave it is gone. Edmund's death, according to Oliver's source, was not peaceful. It was not quick, and it had the particular quality of things that come back, of consequences that have been deferred rather than avoided, of a reckoning that arrives eventually regardless of how much money and position and knowledge of dark things you have accumulated. Oliver's source was specific about this. The manner of Edmund's end was terrible, but the source was also clear about something else. The young woman's name is not remembered. No one thought to record it. She was someone's daughter, someone's new wife, someone's, potentially, future. And all of that was traded, was used, was poured into a hole of ground to make water appear, by a man who wanted something and saw no obstacle in his path that he was not willing to remove. And here's the thing nobody could explain and nobody needed to explain, because it explains itself. The practitioner who taught Edmund, the man who had been tortured into sharing his knowledge, knew what Edmund would eventually do with it. Not the specifics, but the general shape. The inevitable direction of a man like Edmund, armed with knowledge like that. He had tried to prevent it. He had been prevented from preventing it. And he carried that weight for the rest of his life. Oliver told me that his source, the 100-year-old man who told the story, fell silent for a long time after finishing it. And then he said one thing, just one. The pond remembers. Water has a longer memory than people. I've been sitting with that sentence for a while now. And I think it's the truest thing in this entire story. Longer even than the story itself. Because everything else in this account is specific to one time and one place and one terrible sequence of decisions made by one man who should never have been given the tools he was given. But that sentence, the pond remembers, that applies to everything, every dark transaction, every harm done in secret, every price paid by someone who had no say in the matter. The water remembers. And eventually, whether we see it or not, it surfaces. Some stories arrive with a warning built into them, a quality in the telling that makes you understand, before the details fully assembled themselves, that what you are about to hear does not end well. That's somewhere in the middle of this account. Somewhere between the beginning, which looks almost ordinary, and the end, which does not. A line gets crossed that cannot be uncrossed. A door gets opened that cannot be shut again. This is one of those stories. It was sent in by a listener named Samuel, and Samuel was careful in the way that people are careful when they are talking about real events involving real people from their own community, to protect certain specifics. Names changed. Location implied rather than stated outright. But the core of what he described, the events that he heard about from a friend, in the specific kind of late-night conversation that tends to produce the truest accounts, those he gave me as faithfully as he could. And I am giving them to you the same way. This happened in a neighborhood of a major American city. A neighbor that Samuel's listeners will recognize from a single detail he provided, and that I will leave exactly as vague as he left it, because the point is not the geography. The point is what happened to a girl named Rhea, and what Rhea chose to do, and what that choice cost her. Let's go. The neighborhood was the kind that cities produce when old money and working families and immigrant communities have been layered on top of each other over generations. Dense, characterful, full of the specific energy of people who know their neighbors and have opinions about each other and share, at some fundamental level, a sense of being part of something that belongs to them. Not a wealthy neighborhood, not a desperate one, something in between. The kind of place where people watch out for each other's children and argue about parking and show up with food when someone's family has a loss. Rhea's family had been part of this neighborhood for long enough that they were woven into the fabric of it. Her father, her mother, Rhea herself, and her younger sister. 4 people in a building they owned, the first 3 floors of which were their domain. First floor empty, used for storage. Second floor Rhea's. Third floor, her parents'. Above them, rental tenants who came and went in the way that rental tenants do. The community knew Rhea primarily for one thing, and I am going to tell you what that thing was because it matters to what comes later. She was, by the universal account of everyone in that neighborhood, extraordinarily beautiful. Not in the generic, interchangeable way that the word beautiful is sometimes used. In a specific, particular way. The kind of beauty that people notice and remember, that people mention separately when asked about her without prompting, because it is the first thing their minds reach for. Samuel's friend, who knew Rhea and watched what happened to her, described it this way: there was simply no one in that neighborhood who looked like Rhea. She was distinctive in the way that very few people are distinctive. The kind of person you see once and don't forget. This is important. Hold on to it. At some point, and the exact timing is not something Samuel's source could pin down precisely, which is itself interesting, because these things rarely have a single identifiable moment of origin. Rhea began to change. Not her appearance. Not at first. Her behavior. Her patterns. The way she related to the people around her. It started, as these things often do, with distance. Rhea began talking about wanting to move. Not out of the city, just out of the shared family space, to a different floor, a different arrangement. Given that the building was largely theirs, this was practically simple. She relocated to the second floor, set herself up there independently, began closing down the access that the people around her had always taken for granted. Her parents noticed. Her sister noticed. The neighbors noticed, because in a community that dense and that interconnected, everything is eventually noticed. But change is not automatically alarming. People pull away sometimes. People need space. People go through phases of recalibration that look strange from the outside and make perfect sense from the inside. Nobody at this stage was reaching for the worst explanation. Then Rhea stopped letting her family into her space. Not gradually, not with negotiation or discussion. One day the second floor was simply no longer accessible to her parents or her sister. Visits were not welcome. The door stayed closed. Rhea communicated, minimally, through the specific channel she chose to leave open, which was that her younger sister could bring food 3 times a day. That was the one point of contact she preserved. The one thread still connecting her to the family below. And then the water started. The building's community, the people above Rhea's floor, the people who came and went through the shared spaces of that dense residential structure, were Muslim, predominantly, practicing. The kind of practicing that means the rhythms of prayer genuinely structure the day. People leaving for the mosque and returning from it. People coming home from their evening prayers. And here is the thing that Samuel's friend noticed and reported with the specific incredulity of someone who still, years later, cannot fully account for what they saw. When people came home from prayer, not from shopping, not from work, from any ordinary errand, specifically from prayer. Something happened in the corridor outside Rhea's floor, from the ventilation gap above Rhea's door. The old-fashioned type of gap that older buildings in that neighborhood still had, a small rectangular opening for air circulation. Hot water would come. Thrown. Targeted. At the people returning from their devotions. Not at everyone, not randomly. Specifically and consistently at people who had just been praying. Samuel's friend was clear about this distinction. He tested it in the unsystematic way that alarmed people test things. Paying attention to the pattern, checking it against his own movements. When he went to the store, when he came home from work, nothing. When he came home from the mosque, water, consistently, reliably enough to constitute a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Was it Ria throwing the water? People said it was, but no one ever saw her do it. No one ever caught her in the act. The water simply appeared from behind the closed door of the second floor, directed with an accuracy that seemed to require knowledge of who was in the corridor and why. The food deliveries continued. 3 times a day, Ria's younger sister would bring meals to the second floor door and knock. Ria would open the door enough to take what was brought and then close it again. No conversation beyond the minimum. No visible distress. No invitation to enter. This was the entire extent of Ria's engagement with her family during this period. And then came the day when the door did not open. The younger sister knocked. No response. She knocked again. And again. She called Ria's name. She called it through the door, through the ventilation gap, through her phone, calling and getting nothing back. She went upstairs and got her parents. Her parents knocked. Her father called. No answer. This went on, not hours, days. The door did not open. The phone was not answered. And the family, who had been trying to interpret Ria's behavior charitably for months, who had been telling themselves that this was a phase, that Ria was going through something that she would come through, who had been handing food through a door and pretending that this was an acceptable arrangement. The family arrived, finally, at the place they had been avoiding. Something was wrong. They called the person in their community who filled the role that families in that situation call on. A relative of a relative, a man who had military background, who was known for being capable in situations that required a combination of physical competence and calm judgment. I'll call him Daniel. Daniel was not Ria's immediate family, but he was connected enough to be trusted and capable enough to be useful. Daniel came at 10 o'clock at night. He knocked on Ria's door. He called her name. He knocked harder. Nothing. He called the police. The police arrived. They assessed the situation. An adult woman, no contact for multiple days, family unable to access the premises, and made the determination that entry was warranted. They attempted to open the door. The door did not open. Not because of a conventional lock failing, because something on the inside was physically blocking it. Something heavy pressed against the door from within, holding it shut with a resistance that suggested considerable mass. They worked at it. They got the door partially open. Perhaps 8 inches, perhaps 10, before it caught against whatever was blocking it from the inside. Not enough for a person to pass through. Barely enough to see anything. Daniel, who had the particular combination of fitness and technique that comes from military training, assessed the gap. It was not a comfortable entry point. But he made it work. He got inside. The first thing he noticed was the darkness. Ria had covered every source of natural light in the apartment. Windows, gaps, anything that might let in the outside world. The second thing he noticed was that the furniture had been rearranged. Everything moved. Everything repositioned in ways that had no obvious functional logic, that seemed to reflect an internal organization entirely unrelated to the normal purpose of the objects involved. Chairs facing walls. Table pushed into a corner it was never designed to occupy. Every piece of furniture draped in cloth, white or close to white, covering everything. The way Daniel thought that you cover furniture in a house that has been abandoned. And beneath all of it, beneath the darkness and the rearrangement and the draped white cloths, a smell. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I think the way it was described to Samuel's friend, and the way Samuel's friend described it to Samuel matters. It was not a smell that could be attributed to any single obvious source. It was compound, dense. The kind of smell that hits you before you've fully processed that you're smelling anything that registers as wrong at some level below conscious thought. The kind of smell that makes your body want to leave a room before your mind has finished explaining why. Daniel was a man with military experience. He had been in situations that the majority of people never encounter. He was, by Samuel's account, genuinely difficult to disturb. The smell disturbed him. He found the door to the guest bathroom. The light inside was on, a thin line of it visible at the base of the door. The smell was strongest here. He pushed the door open. And here's where things get really dark. I am going to tell you what was in that bathroom. I am going to tell you plainly because obscuring it would be a disservice to what actually happened and to the people who had to deal with it. But I also want to acknowledge before I do that what follows is extremely difficult. If you need a moment before we continue, take it. Ria was in the bathroom. She had been there for some time, long enough for what happens to a human body when it is no longer maintained, when the systems that keep a body functioning begin their irreversible shutdown. To have progressed significantly, she was unclothed. Her face was pressed into the bowl of the toilet. Her position suggested that she had been there, in that configuration, for far longer than any living person could have maintained it voluntarily. And when the emergency responders who were eventually called in, people whose professional experience gave them access to compounds that could enable them to work in conditions that would overwhelm most people. When those responders attempted to move her body, something happened that Daniel and the others present described consistently and could not explain. Her bones were detaching, not in the way that decomposition eventually produces, in a way that preceded the stages at which that would have been expected. When they touched her, the structural connections between her bones were simply absent, not degraded, not weakened, gone. As though something had systematically removed the connective tissue that held the skeleton together, leaving the bones independent of each other in a way that the body is never supposed to allow. They managed to remove her. It took considerable time and required resources that Samuel's friend said he had never seen deployed at a scene like this before. When they finally turned her face toward the light, her face was black, from the forehead to the chin, not bruised, not discolored by decomposition in any way that corresponded to the stage of the body's condition. A complete, total, uniform blackening of every visible feature of her face, as though her face, specifically, had been erased. As though whatever she had looked like, whatever had made people in that neighborhood say, without prompting, that there was simply no one who looked like Rhea, had been taken, completely and finally taken. The official determination, as these determinations tend to be in cases where the available evidence does not fit neatly into the categories that official systems are built to process, was suicide. The family accepted this determination in the way that families accept official determinations. Not because they believed it, but because the alternative was an argument they did not have the resources or the framework to make within the institutional context they were dealing with. They buried their daughter. They buried their sister. They made the arrangements that grief requires people to make, in the specific mechanical way that profound grief sometimes produces, moving through the necessary steps because the steps must be taken, and feeling everything later. The burial itself did not go smoothly. The vehicle transporting Rhea's body had a tire failure on the way to the cemetery. A full tire failure, not a slow leak, not a gradual deflation. The kind of catastrophic failure that brings a vehicle to an immediate and unplanned stop. The family transferred the casket to a second vehicle. That vehicle encountered its own difficulties. Difficulties that Samuel's friend described obliquely, as though the specifics were too strange to relay without seeming to embellish. What he said was this: there were obstructions. Multiple, of different kinds, as though the process of getting Rhea's body from where it was to where it was supposed to go was being actively resisted by something that wanted the process not to complete. At the cemetery, a large, well-known burial ground that had been serving the community for well over a century, the section where Rhea was to be interred was, by the family's account, quieter than it should have been for that time of day. As though the usual ambient activity of a busy public space had been drained out of that particular corner of the grounds. They found a plot. They prepared it. They lowered the casket. The casket rose back up, not figuratively, not as metaphor. Water welled up from beneath the prepared grave, filling the space faster than the soil could absorb it, lifting the casket up and out of the ground as though the ground itself was refusing to accept what was being offered to it. This happened multiple times. Each time the family and the cemetery workers attempted to complete the burial, the water returned and the casket rose. Eventually, with considerable effort, with additional materials, with a process that took far longer and required far more people than a burial should ever require, it was done. The grave was secured. The casket was held in place by means that went beyond the conventional, and Rhea was finally permanently in the ground now. Here is the part of Oz story that Samuel's friend shared last, as though he had been building toward it. As though the preceding information was context, and this was the thing that actually needed to be understood. The police investigation of Rhea's apartment. The process of documenting what was there, of trying to construct a picture of how a young woman had arrived at the state in which she was found. Eventually reached the locked room. Every apartment has a logic to it. A flow. A way in which the rooms relate to each other and to the lives of the people who inhabit them. Rhea's apartment had followed that logic, mostly, except for one room that was locked differently from the others. That had a lock that the responding officers had not seen before and needed specific equipment to address. When they got through it, the room was empty, not sparse, not minimal. Empty in the specific way that a room has been deliberately cleared of everything it once contained, down to the last object. No furniture, no stored items, no accumulated domestic debris, nothing on the walls, nothing on the floor except this. In the center of the floor, drawn or inscribed, or constructed by some process that the investigator's documentation does not specify, a circle, and within the circle, a 5-pointed star. The specific configuration that, in the tradition Samuel's friend referenced, is associated with a very particular kind of deliberate invocation, a calling in, A formal summons of something that does not arrive unless called. The configuration was not drawn in paint or chalk or any conventional marking medium. The investigators' documentation noted the material and then, apparently, declined to elaborate on it further in the official record. Samuel's friend, who had access to someone who had access to the documentation, said only that it was organic, that it was dark, and that it had clearly taken considerable time and deliberate effort to produce. The investigation eventually reached the church. Not a church that Rhea had grown up attending, a church she had begun attending at some point during the period of her withdrawal, during the months when she had become unreachable to her family, independently. A church in the neighborhood, one that Samuel's listeners will know and that I will not name specifically for the same reasons I have not named anything else specifically in this story. The people at this church confirmed that Rhea had been there, that she had come to them during that period, that she had engaged, seriously, apparently sincerely, with the community and its practices. And then, according to the people Samuel's friend spoke to there, she had begun engaging with something else. Something that was running adjacent to the church. Something that used the church's framework as a door, as a point of entry into a world that the church itself would not have endorsed or facilitated. Something that had found, in Rhea's particular combination of beauty and desire, and whatever was that had made her want to be more. That had found in all of that a very useful starting point. The people from the church told Samuel's friend what they knew, and what they knew was this. Rhea had made a deal, a formal, deliberate, structured deal with something she had invoked in that locked room. The terms of the deal were, according to what the church members had pieced together from Rhea's conversations with them during the period when she was still talking to people. Straightforward, in the way that these deals are always described as straightforward, right up until they aren't. She wanted her beauty enhanced, intensified, made not merely notable, which it already was, but extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that changes the trajectory of a life, that opens doors, that makes possible things that would otherwise remain closed. And the thing she had invoked, the entity, the force, the presence that had heard her summons from that center of that circle and had decided that this particular transaction was worth engaging with, had said yes. It had said yes, and it had delivered. During the period of Rhea's withdrawal, the period when her family could not see her, when the door was closed and the only contact was a plate of food 3 times a day, something had changed in Rhea's appearance. The people who occasionally caught a glimpse of her during those months described it with a consistency that Samuel's friend found striking. She looked different. Not dramatically, visibly different in a way that demanded explanation, but different in the way that a room looks different when the light source has been subtly adjusted. The same elements, rearranged in a way that somehow produces a result that transcends the sum of its parts. The deal had been honored. The delivery had been made. And then the entity had presented its side of the bargain. Samuel's friend did not know exactly what was asked of Rhea. That specific detail did not survive the chain of transmission from Rhea to the church community to Samuel's friend to Samuel to me. What Samuel's friend knew, what the church community had conveyed, was the general shape of it. That it was something Rhea could not give. That when she understood what was being asked, she refused. That the refusal was genuine, not a negotiating position, not a delay tactic, but a real heartfelt, fundamental no. And that the entity's response to her refusal was what produced the state in which she was found. There were others, apparently, who had been in contact with Rhea during this period. People from the church community who had engaged with her, who had been drawn into orbit around whatever she was involved with. Some of them had begun practicing alongside her. Some of them had made their own smaller transactions, their own engagements with the thing Rhea had called in. And in the weeks following Rhea's death, in the specific, unaccountable way that these things sometimes propagate, those people began to disappear. Not die. Disappear. Gone from their residences, from their contacts from the community in a way that left no clear trail. The people from the church who spoke to Samuel's friend said this part quietly. Not with drama. With the flatness of people who have processed something that they do not fully understand and have decided, for their own sanity, not to look at it too directly. The people who had been closest to whatever Rhea was doing, they were gone. And wherever they were, nobody had been able to find them. I need you to understand something about Rhea before I close this story. She was not a foolish person. She was not reckless, or thrill-seeking, or drawn to dark things the way some people are drawn to dark things, out of boredom, or nihilism, or a desire for transgression. She was, by every account, someone who wanted something very specific. Something that is, in itself, entirely human and entirely understandable. She wanted to be more than she was. She looked in the mirror and saw something that most people would have been grateful for. But she saw, alongside it, a gap. A distance between what she had and what she imagined she could have. a feeling that is so common as to be nearly universal. She found a method that seemed to address that gap. She pursued it. She made a transaction without fully understanding the terms, and when the terms became clear, when she understood what honoring them would actually require, she refused. And here is the part I want you to sit with. Here is the part that I think is the real horror of this story, underneath all the specific, terrible details. The refusal was the right thing. The refusal was the morally correct response to an impossible demand. Ria said no to something that she should have said no to, and it killed her. There is no tidy resolution here. No Pagla and Lala arriving to retrieve what was taken. No community of principled people finding a way to restore what was lost. The justice system called it suicide and filed the paperwork. The cemetery workers eventually secured the grave. The people who had been drawn into Ria's orbit disappeared into whatever it is that people disappear into when these things go wrong at this scale. And the neighborhood, the dense, interconnected, watchful neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's name and had opinions about the parking, that neighborhood absorbed the loss the way neighborhoods absorb losses. Slowly, with grief that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't know how to, with the specific kind of haunting that comes not from supernatural forces but from the simple, devastating fact of a young woman who was alive and is no longer alive and whose beauty, the specific, particular beauty that everyone remembered without being asked to remember it, is simply gone from the world. Now I want you to think about that for a second. Not about the entity, not about the ritual, not about the locked room or the dark circle or the terrible things the first responders found. Think about the girl. Think about the gap she felt between what she had and what she wanted. Think about how ordinary that gap is. How many people feel it without acting on it in any dangerous way? And then think about what it means that the specific method Ria found to address that gap, the specific door she walked through, was standing open. That it was accessible. That it had found her, in some sense, as much as she had found it. Because the market, the spirit market, the dark market, the market where things are traded that should never be traded, it is not only in the deep forests of West Africa. It is not only in places with hundred-year-old traditions of occult practice and spirit negotiation. It is in every city, in every neighborhood, in every place where desperate people and dark forces occupy the same geography. It is looking for exactly the thing Ria had: the gap. The hunger. The perfectly human desire to be more than you currently are. And it is always willing to make a deal. There are places in the world that simply do not want people in them. Not metaphorically. Not in the poetic sense of a landscape that is too remote or beautiful or too fragile for human interference. I mean places that actively, deliberately, persistently resist the presence of human beings. Places where the trees are too close together and the air is too heavy and the silence has a texture to it, a density, that you can actually feel pressing against the side of your face when you turn your head. And if you are unlucky enough to work in a place like that, if you spend your days and nights inside the perimeter of something that does not want you there, then the things that happen to you are not random. They are not coincidental. They are not the product of stress or isolation or overwork, no matter how many doctors and supervisors and well-meaning colleagues try to convince you otherwise. They are intentional. This story was sent in by a listener named Christopher Alam, and Christopher wanted to share an account that was given to him by a woman named Lisa. Lisa is a real person. The events she described happened to her. And while I've changed certain identifying details to protect her and the people involved, the substance of what she went through has not been altered, softened, or dramatized in any way. Because it didn't need to be. It was December 2015. Lisa had recently started a new job with a mining and resource extraction company that operated in the mountains of West Virginia. The deep, densely forested backcountry where the nearest town might be 20 miles away and the nearest hospital might as well be on the moon. The company had set up its operational base inside the forest itself, a compound of prefabricated offices, equipment sheds, and a small residential block that served as a dormitory for employees who were too far from civilization to commute. Lisa was offered a bunk in that dormitory. Most of the other staff used it, but Lisa had a house in the nearest town, not far by highway standards, at a solid 40-minute drive through winding mountain roads that cut through some of the densest woodland in the state. She preferred to go home at the end of each shift. She liked her own bed. She liked the separation between work and rest. And she was, by her own account, not the kind of person who scared easily. She would later say that this last detail was the one she most wished she could take back. On the day this story begins, Lisa finished her shift around 5 in the afternoon. It was mid-December. In the mountains, that meant the light was already failing. The sun drops behind the winchline early in winter, and the transition from gray daylight to full darkness happens faster than you expect. By the time Lisa had packed her bag and walked to the car park, The sky was the color of cold iron, and the forest around the compound had already begun to merge into one continuous dark mass. Her colleagues were in the common room. Kevin, a senior equipment operator, was staying late to finish paperwork. With him were Harrison, Raymond, and a younger staff member everyone called Sonny. They were drinking coffee, winding down, doing the specific kind of low-energy socializing that people do at the end of a long day in an isolated workplace. Sonny said to her more than once, "Lisa, don't go tonight. Stay here. The fog is getting thick out there and that road is not your friend in the dark." Lisa waved him off. She smiled. She said goodnight to everyone. She walked out to the car park, got into her car, and drove through the compound gate. The security guard, an older man with the careful manner of someone who had seen a lot of nights in that forest, said to her as she passed, "Drive careful tonight, ma'am. The sky looks strange this evening." Lisa nodded and pulled onto the access road. The road from the compound to the main highway was approximately 7 miles of unpaved single track, cutting through forests so dense that the headlights only illuminated about 30 feet ahead before the trees swallowed the rest. No streetlights, no houses, no other vehicles. Just the rumble of tires on gravel and the sweeping arc of Lisa beams picking out tree trunks, rock faces, and the occasional glint of animal eyes in the undergrowth. For the first 10 minutes, everything was normal. The kind of normal that is so complete and so unremarkable that you stop paying attention to it. The radio was on. The heater was running. Lisa was thinking about dinner. And then, somewhere around the 15-minute mark, the silence arrived. Not ordinary silence, not the absence of conversation or music. Lisa turned the radio off without really deciding to and became aware, in a way that she could not immediately explain, that the forest outside her car had stopped making sound. No insects. No wind in the canopy. No distant rustle of animals moving through brush. Nothing. The kind of nothing that is not empty. The kind of nothing that is full of something that has chosen to be quiet. Lisa gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. She found herself reaching for a prayer she had memorized as a child, something she hadn't said in years. The words came back automatically, the way childhood words sometimes do when the adult mind decides it's time to stop pretending it has everything under control. And then, behind her, from somewhere that seemed to be inside the car rather than outside it, a sound. A dry, papery rustle, like something shifting its weight on the back seat. Lisa's eyes flicked to the rear view mirror. The mirror showed the back seat. The back seat showed nothing. Darkness, and through the rear windscreen, more darkness. No shape. No movement, nothing she could point to. She exhaled. And then, directly beside her left ear, close enough that she felt the moving air against her skin, someone whispered. The voice was thin, high, pitched in a way that did not sound human. And the language, Lisa was very clear about this, was not English. Not any language she recognized. A string of syllables that seemed to bypass her conscious mind entirely and land somewhere deeper. Somewhere that understood the tone if not the content. Lisa's chest locked. She pressed the accelerator. The road ahead climbed a short rise, a natural ridge in the terrain that required a brief reduction in speed. Lisa slowed for the crest, and from directly behind her, not from the cars, not from outside the car, from behind the driver's seat, a laugh. Loud, full, sustained, the kind of laugh that is not amused, that has no joy in it, that exists purely to let you know that something you and finds your fear entertaining. Lisa lost control of the car. The vehicle skidded on the loose gravel surface, slid sideways, left the road and plunged nose first into the dense brush at the roadside. Lisa was thrown forward against the steering wheel. Her hands took the worst of the impact, then her knee hit the dashboard. The engine stalled. The headlights went out. And in the sudden, absolute, impenetrable darkness of the forest at night, Lisa found herself sitting in a dead car at the bottom of a shallow ditch, bleeding from a gash on her shin, completely alone. Or, she hoped, completely alone. She fumbled for her phone. It wasn't in her pocket. It wasn't in the door well. It wasn't in the central console. The impact had thrown it somewhere. Under the seat, into the footwell, somewhere she couldn't reach without light, and the car's interior lights had died with the engine. Lisa forced herself to breathe. She said, out loud in the dark to no one, "Lisa, calm down. This is a car accident. You are hurt, but you are conscious. The car will restart. The phone will turn up. This is manageable." She pushed the door open and climbed out. The air outside was freezing. December in the mountains. She could see her breath, barely, in the faintest ambient light filtering through the cloud cover. The car was tilted at an angle, one front wheel partially buried in soft earth. She walked around to the front, put her hands on the bonnet, and tried to assess whether the vehicle could be pulled back onto the road. And that was when she smelled it. A smell that had no business being in a forest in December. Not pine, not damp earth, not any of the usual mountain smells. Something organic and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The kind of smell that arrives before the thing producing it does. The kind of smell that your body interprets as a signal to leave before your mind has processed why. Lisa turned around. Behind her, perhaps 50 yards away, set back from the road on a small rise and partially obscured by trees, was the outline of a cemetery, old, neglected, the kind of small rural burial ground that dots the Appalachian backcountry. Places where logging workers, miners, and mountain families were buried in previous centuries and then largely forgotten. The headstones were barely visible in the darkness, just pale rectangular shapes, some tilted, some fallen, none maintained. Lisa turned back to the car. She got in. She turned the key. Nothing. She turned it again. Pumped the accelerator. Checked the dash pulley. Car was completely, comprehensively dead. Not struggling to start. Not turning over slowly. Not making any sound at all. As though the battery, the starter motor, and every electrical system in the vehicle had simultaneously decided to stop existing. Lisa sat in the driver's seat of her dead car in the pitch dark on an empty mountain road next to an abandoned cemetery, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt the specific, primal, ice water, in the veins kind of fear that exists below rational thought. The kind that makes your vision sharpen and your hearing expand and every nerve in your body orient toward a single, wordless imperative. Run. But she didn't run, because running meant leaving the car. And leaving the car meant being on foot in the dark on a mountain road with whatever was producing that smell. She heard it then. Behind her, from the direction of the cemetery, a rhythmic, heavy, thudding sound, not footsteps. Footsteps have a regularity, a left-right alternation that the human ear recognizes instinctively. This was something else. A single repeated impact, like something landing on the ground from a height over and over. Like something moving toward her by jumping. Lisa turned her head. In the ambient gray of the cloud-filtered moonlight, she saw it. A shape, white, approximately 4 feet tall, moving toward her car from the direction of the cemetery. Moving not by walking, not by running, by jumping. Landing on the ground with both feet, then launching again immediately. Covering the distance between the cemetery fence and the road with a speed that was far greater than the method of locomotion should have allowed. And as it got closer, close enough for Lisa's dark, adapted-out details she desperately wished they could not, she saw what it was. It was wrapped in white cloth. Old cloth. Stained. The kind of wrapping that is placed around a body before burial. The kind of cloth that should be underground, that should be invisible, that should never be seen again by anyone. The shape had no face. Where the face should have been, where the cloth should have been stretched across the contours of a nose, a mouth, a brow, the surface was flat, smooth, as though whoever was inside the cloth had been assembled without the equipment necessary for being seen. An approximation of a person that had not bothered with the face because the face was not the point. Lisa did not scream. She wanted to. She told Christopher later that the scream was there, fully formed, sitting in her throat like a physical object. But it would not come out. Her body had bypassed the scream and gone directly to action. She kicked the car door open, grabbed the steering wheel, threw her weight against the vehicle, and began pushing. The car was heavy. The ditch was soft. She was dragging a vehicle through mud and brush with nothing but adrenaline and terror. And behind her, that thudding sound was getting closer. She made it approximately 200 yards before her legs gave out. There was a structure at the roadside, an old bus shelter, or perhaps a derelict roadside stand, tin, roofed and rusted. Lisa collapsed under it, gasping, her injured legs screaming, her hands raw, and then headlights. Distant at first, coming down the mountain from the opposite direction, growing closer, the sound of an engine, the sound of tires on gravel, the sound of civilization. A car pulled up, an older man driving, gray shirt, checked trousers, a face that was weathered and kind and completely ordinary. He looked at Lisa through his open window and said, very calmly, "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Car trouble." Lisa could have kissed him. She could have cried. She did neither. She said, in a voice that was shaking so badly the words barely held together, "My car won't start. I crashed. I can't. I need help." The man got out. He walked to Lisa's car, looked it over briefly, and gave the ignition a single turn. The engine started immediately. Lisa stared at the dashboard. The lights were on. The engine was running perfectly. She had spent 20 minutes kicking and turning and pumping, and nothing had happened. This man had walked over and started it on the first attempt. "These things happen in the cold," he said. "Come on, I'll follow you to the main road." He did. He drove behind her, his headlights filling her rear view mirror like a pair of guardian eyes, until they reached the highway junction. Then he waved, turned the other way, and disappeared into the night. Lisa drove home with the radio off and every light in the car on full. Her mother took one look at her and handed her a crucifix. Her mother said, "You're not going to work tomorrow." Lisa didn't argue. The next morning, Lisa woke with a fever so intense that her sheets were soaked through. Her body ached from the crash, but the fever was something else. Something that felt less like illness and more like a response. As though her body was trying to burn something out of itself. At 11 a.m., her phone rang. It was Sonny. He was talking fast. Too fast. The The kind of fast that people talk when they're frightened and try and pretend they're merely excited. Lisa, where are you? Why aren't you at the office? Do you know what happened last night? Kevin's lost his mind. He's gone completely. Lisa, you need to get here. Despite her fever, despite every sensible instinct telling her to stay in bed, got dressed and took a taxi to the compound. What she found when she arrived was worse than anything the night before. Kevin, the senior operator, the steady-handed equipment man, the person everyone relied on to remain calm in exactly the kind of situation that was currently unfolding, was in the back office, restrained, tied to a chair with rope because conventional restraint had failed. 4 members of staff were in the room with him. They were all frightened. They were all frightened. Kevin's eyes had rolled back in his head. The white portions of his eyes were visible and nothing else. His mouth was producing a foam. Not saliva, not anything like a normal biological secretion. A dense, wettish substance that bubbled at the corners of his lips and dripped onto his shirt. He did not recognize anyone. The previous night, Sonny told Lisa, Kevin had been working late in the equipment shed. Sometime around 9 p.m., he had stopped the excavator he was operating, climbed down from the cab, and begun laughing. Not normal laughter. The kind of laughter that has no cause and no end. The kind that doesn't stop when the joke is over, because there was never a joke to begin with. Staff members who approached him found that his eyes had already turned. He was unresponsive to his own name, and his body, his ordinary, middle-aged, moderately overweight body, had become, in the space of minutes, impossibly strong. It took 5 men to get him indoors. Once inside, his voice changed. Not his volume or his accent, his voice. The actual fundamental quality of the sound his throat was producing. It became deeper, thicker, layered, as though multiple people were speaking through the same mouth simultaneously. And the things it said were not things Kevin knew. Lisa stood outside the door of the room where Kevin was restrained and listened. And what she heard in that voice that was, and was not Kevin's, was a sentence directed specifically at her. You've come back, I told you. Next time you die, let me in. Let me inside you. You and I together. We'll show them all something they'll never forget. Lisa took a step back. Raymond, the logistics manager, was standing beside her. He put his hand on her arm and said, very quietly, Lisa, don't listen to him. That's not Kevin talking. Lisa knew that. She knew it intellectually. But the thing using Kevin's mouth knew things it should not have known. It referenced her brother, her older brother, who had died in a car accident 13 years earlier. 13 years ago, the voice said through Kevin's foam-flecked lips, your brother, we did that. We took him. And now it's your turn. Lisa had never told anyone at that company about her brother. Kevin had never met her family. There was no possible way he could have known. Raymond pulled her away from the door. He said, we've called a priest from the parish in town. He's on his way. The priest arrived in the early afternoon. He was not a young man. He carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who has been doing this kind of work for long enough that the novelty has worn off entirely, and what remains is simply the discipline. He had a Bible in one hand and a small bottle of holy water in the other. He went into Kevin's room alone. For the next 40 minutes, the sounds that came from behind that closed door were not things that Lisa could categorize. Not screaming, exactly, though there was screaming. Not prayer, exactly, though there was prayer. Something in between. Something that sounded like 2 forces occupying the same space and disagreeing violently about which one belonged there. At one point, Kevin's voice, not Kevin's voice, said something that made the priest raise his own voice to a shout. Then silence, then more sounds, then silence again. The priest came out. His forehead was drenched. His shirt collar was torn. He looked 10 years older than he had an hour earlier. He said, this is not something I can resolve here. The presence in that man is old. It's deeply embedded. We need to move him to the rectory. I have a room prepared for this kind of work. It's not safe to continue in this location. And then he turned to Lisa. Young lady, I need you to listen to me carefully. What I am going to give you. And here he produced a small clay dish containing what appeared to be blessed sand or salt. You will place at the threshold of wherever you sleep tonight. Every door, every window, and whatever you hear. Whatever knocks, whatever calls your name, whatever sounds like someone you know asking you to open the door to it. You do not open it. You do not go outside. You do not respond. Do you understand me? Lisa nodded. Everyone left. Kevin was transported to the rectory in town. Raymond and Harrison went with him. The priest went with them. Sonny stayed behind to help Lisa, who was shaking so badly she could barely stand. The compound emptied. Lisa went to her assigned room in the dormitory block. She placed the blessed material at the door. She closed the windows. She turned on every light in the room. She lay on the bed with her coat still on and her shoes still laced, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that sleep was possible. Sleep was not possible, but at some point, she could not say when, Exhaustion won the argument with fear, and she closed her eyes. She opened them again at what her phone told her was 2:47 a.m. The room was dark. The lights she had left on were off. All of them. She reached for the bedside lamp. Dead. She tried the overhead switch. Dead. The power in the building, or at least in her room, had failed. And in the silence that followed, she heard it. Fingernails on glass, a slow, deliberate scraping on the window pane, not the branch of a tree, not an animal, the specific, rhythmic, intelligent sound of something that has fingers and is using them to tell you it knows you're there. Lisa pulled the blanket over her head. The scraping stopped. And then the knocking began. Not on the window, on the door. A steady, patient, evenly spaced knocking. The kind of knocking that does not become louder or more frantic because the thing doing the knocking is not frustrated. It is simply waiting. It has all the time it needs. It knows you are inside. It knows you can hear it. And it is content to knock until you open the door, or until something else happens that makes the door no longer relevant. Lisa held still. She remembered the priest's words. She did not move. Her phone rang. The screen showed no caller ID, no number, just a blank incoming call. Lisa answered it because in that moment, alone, in the dark, with something knocking on her door, the phone was the only connection to another human voice she had. But the voice on the other end was not human. It was the whisper. The same whisper from the car. The same thin, high, inhuman register that had spoken to her in language she did not recognize. Except this time it spoke in English. The first time you see us, your heart will seize. Pain like a knife, pain through your whole body. The second time you see us, the blood from your heart will pour from your nose and mouth. The third time you see us, you die. The call ended. Lisa dropped the phone. And then the door. Her door, the door with the blessed material at its threshold, shuddered. Not a knock this time. An impact. Something hitting it with the full weight of a large body. The door frame creaked. The hinges protested. The blessed material on the floor jumped and scattered. Lisa began praying. She recited every verse, every psalm, every fragment of scripture she could pull from her memory. And from the other side of the door, matching her word for word, came a mocking laugh that seemed to find the prayer not threatening but amusing. This went on for what felt like hours. And then it stopped. And then the birds began to sing. Dawn. Lisa opened her eyes. The lights in the room were on again, all of them as though they had never been off. The door was intact. The blessed material was scattered across the threshold, but still partially in place. And on the floor, just outside the door, where the thing had been standing, a small deposit of what appeared to be dried, blackened skin, flakes of it like shed scales dark and papery, forming a rough outline of where 2 feet had been. The days that followed did not improve. Lisa went to the office the next morning because staying alone in the dormitory felt worse than being around people. She found Raymond and Harrison looking like men who had not slept. Kevin had been transferred to the rectory the previous night, but his condition had deteriorated further. He had torn chunks of flesh from his own face with his fingernails. The priest was continuing the work, but had called for assistance from a more experienced member of the clergy. Lisa tried to resume normal activities. She went to the canteen to get water, and as she walked through the doorway, she saw Raymond standing in the corridor ahead of her. His back was turned. He was wearing a gray shirt she recognized. She called out to him, "Raymond? How's Kevin doing?" Raymond turned around. He smiled, but the smile was wrong. It sat on his face at a slight angle, like a mask that had been put on carelessly. He said nothing. He extended his hand and placed it on Lisa's shoulder. Lisa recoiled. His hand was cold. Not cool from the air cold. Cold like something that had been stored in a freezer. Cold like something that was not generating its own heat because it did not have the biological machinery necessary to do so. Lisa looked down. Raymond's feet were not touching the floor. He was suspended, hovering. Perhaps an inch of space between the soles of his shoes and the corridor tiles, not floating dramatically, just enough to be visible, just enough to be undeniable. From behind her, Harrison's voice exploded through the corridor.
"Lisa! Who get away from there? Now!"
Lisa turned. Harrison was running toward her, his face white, his eyes enormous. He grabbed her arm and pulled her backward with enough force to nearly knock her off her feet. "Lisa, Raymond is not here. Raymond left for town an hour ago to bring the senior priest. He's 30 miles away. Whoever you were just talking to was not Raymond." Lisa turned back toward the corridor. It was empty, the space where Raymond had been standing, where something wearing Raymond's face had been standing, 1 inch above the ground, with a hand like a freezer compartment, was completely absolutely bare, nothing there. No footprints. No disturbance. Just the corridor, and the faint chemical smell of the floor cleaner, and the distant hum of the fluorescent lights, and nothing else. Things began to accelerate. Sonny found something in the company's old records room that changed the complexion of everything. A survey map from decades earlier, from before the company had established its operation, From when the site had been assessed for a completely different purpose, the map showed the current compound footprint overlaid on what had been there before. What had been there before was not a mine, not a logging operation, not anything commercial. It was a rich commercial. The map used specific terminology that none of them fully understood, references to ceremonial use, to historical spiritual practice, to the kind of activity that gets documented in survey records, but never discussed in planning meetings. And attached to the map was a sketch, a simple pencil drawing, probably done by whoever had conducted the original survey. The drawing showed a figure, a human-shaped form, standing upright, with no face. Beneath the drawing, in handwriting that was too faded to read easily, was a single word in what appeared to be Latin or possibly a creolized variant of it. The figure in the drawing looked exactly like the thing Lisa had seen jumping toward her car from the cemetery. That same afternoon, Harrison came in from the equipment yard and found Lisa and Sonny in the common room. He was breathing hard. He was holding something. "I found this near the perimeter fence," he said. He held out his hand, and it was a corroded metal object, a small medallion or pendant of some kind, and wrapped around it tightly methodically was a length of human hair. Long, dark, old. Lisa stared at it, and then the lights in the common room began to flicker. A voice, not from any person in the room, but from the corridor, from somewhere deeper in the building, from somewhere that had no right to contain a voice, spoke. The language was not English. It was not anything any of them recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, then silence. Then, from Kevin's empty office, the room where he had been restrained the previous day, the room that had been sealed and cleared, a tremendous crash, the sound of heavy furniture being thrown across a room by something with no regard for the furniture's weight or the room's structural limitations. Sonny grabbed Lisa's hand. "We're leaving. Right now. All of us. Get in the truck." They did not pack. They did not secure the offices. They did not follow any of the normal end-of-shift protocols. They put Harrison behind the wheel of the company's heavy-duty truck, loaded the unconscious form of Harrison's colleague, because Harrison, too, had by now begun showing the early signs of whatever was moving through the staff, and drove. Lisa sat in the back seat and stared out of the window as the forest rolled past, and as they passed the cemetery, that same small, neglected, barely visible burial ground that Lisa had crashed beside 2 nights earlier, she saw something through the trees. An old man, standing at the edge of the cemetery, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to another century, looking directly at the truck. His face was calm, his eyes were empty, not hostile, not frightened, just empty. Looking at Lisa, they reached the main road, they reached the town, they reached the hospital. Harrison's colleague was admitted. Lisa sat in the waiting room and shook. Kevin never fully recovered. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility where he remained under long-term care. The medical establishment's explanation: severe psychological break induced by workplace stress and environmental isolation, satisfied the insurance paperwork but convinced no one who had actually been present. Lisa resigned from the company the following week. She did not return to the compound. She did not collect her personal belongings. She did not submit a formal notice. She simply stopped going. For months afterward, she could not work, could not drive alone, could not be in a room with the lights off. The bruise on her shoulder, the one left by the hand of the thing that looked like Raymond, turned black and remained visible for weeks. Her doctor attributed it to the car accident. Lisa did not argue. Harrison eventually told Lisa, months later, that Kevin, in his facility, in his medicated, supervised, theoretically safe environment, still sometimes woke in the middle of the night screaming. And when the nurses asked him what he saw, he always said the same thing: a white body, no face, jumping. I have been thinking about this story for a long time since Christopher first sent it to me, and the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot quite put down, is not the entity, not the cemetery, not the faceless thing in the burial wrappings. It's the compound, because the compound was built on a ritual site. Someone, at some point in the company's history, read a survey map that said, in effect, this location has a spiritual history that should be taken seriously, and then built an office on top of it anyway. Because the economics made sense, because the geology was right, because the trees were the right species and the mineral deposits were at the right depth, and nobody in the planning meeting was going to be the person who said, actually, we might want to pick a different spot because the survey mentions ceremonial activity. That is how most of these stories begin. Not with someone deliberately seeking out something dark, not with a ritual circle or a midnight invocation, but with someone looking at a warning and deciding that it doesn't apply to them. The forest was there first. Whatever was in that forest was there first. And when the company put its buildings and its people and aside at the boundary of something that had been claimed by forces older and less negotiable than corporate property law, those forces did not file a complaint. They simply made their position clear. And here's the thing I need you to understand. Lisa survived. She's alive. She went on to build a different life in a different place, far from mountains and forests and abandoned cemeteries. She's okay. But Kevin isn't. And whatever is in that forest, whatever was there before the company and will be there after the company and doesn't care about survey maps or planning permissions or the rational explanations that comfortable people offer from the safety of well-lit offices. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. It was there when Lisa drove through it in December 2015. It will be there the next time someone drives through it. And the time after that. And every time after that. Until someone finally reads the map, sees the warning, and listens. Sometimes a story doesn't need an hour to tell. Sometimes the thing that stays with you longest is the thing that took 30 seconds to happen and a lifetime to understand. These two brief accounts were sent in by the same listener, a man named James, who shared them back to back, one from his grandfather and one from his wife's grandfather. Both are short. Both are simple, and both left marks on the people who lived them that never fully faded. Here they are. Tale 1, The Night Visitors. James's grandfather was a scholar, a man of deep faith and serious learning who had spent the better part of his adult life teaching theology at a seminary in rural Georgia. He was, by every account, a quiet man, principled, devoted to his work, not the kind of person who sought attention or embellished stories for dramatic effect. When he told you something, you could take it to the bank. Before he became a teacher, James's grandfather had been a student himself, and like many students of that era, particularly students in rural areas who could not afford room and board at their institution, he lived as a lodger. He rented a room in a private home, contributed to the household in whatever way he could, and walked or rode to his classes each day. The man who owned the house where James's grandfather lodged was known in the community as the professor. He was a school teacher by day, but outside school hours, the professor had another role, one that was less public but equally one among the people who needed it. He was a faith healer, a man who dealt with spiritual afflictions, the kind of practitioner that families called when someone in the household was suffering from something that doctors couldn't diagnose and medicine couldn't touch. This meant the professor kept unusual hours. He would leave the house in the evening to visit a patient and sometimes not return until well past midnight. This was normal. James's grandfather was accustomed to it. One night, a night that began like any other, the professor went out to treat a patient. James's grandfather went to bed in his small room, which shared a thin wall with the professor's bedroom. The house was old. The walls were wooden planks. You could hear someone coughing on the other side if the night was quiet enough. James's grandfather fell asleep. He woke sometime around 2 in the morning. Not gradually, suddenly. Something had pulled him out of sleep with the specific urgency of a sound that the unconscious mind recognizes as wrong before the conscious mind has had time to identify it. Voices. Many voices, coming from the professor's room. Not a conversation, a commotion. The sound of multiple people speaking at once, arguing, moving, producing the kind of chaotic noise that happens when a crowd accomplishes something difficult and failing. James's grandfather pressed his ear to the wall. Through the thin wood, he could hear fragments. Hold him down. We can't. He's sealed himself. Here, they're trying. We cannot reach it. James's grandfather's blood went cold. He moved to a gap in the planking, a knot hole or a crack between boards, and looked through into the professor's room. What he saw stopped his breathing. The room was full of figures. Shadow figures. Dark shapes that moved like people, but had no features he could identify in the dim light. They were gathered around the professor's bed, pressing in from all sides, reaching for the man who lay there. The professor was on his back, rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. His mouth was moving, silently or too quietly for James's grandfather to hear, and whatever he was saying seemed to be the only thing preventing the figures from closing the distance. They couldn't touch him. They were trying, with visible, physical effort, to lay their hands on the professor's body, and they were being repelled, not by anything visible, by some quality of the air around the professor himself, an invisible barrier that the shadow figures threw themselves against and could not cross. Then, from outside the house, from the old pecan tree in the yard, a voice, louder than the rest, commanding, a voice that carried the authority of something that was used to being obeyed.
Tear his throat! Rip it out! Finish him!
And the figures inside responded, strained against the barrier, and failed again. This went on for hours. James's grandfather did not sleep. He did not move. He did not call out or intervene because he understood, with the gut-level instinct of a young man witnessing something far beyond his capacity to influence, that involving himself would not help the professor and might very well destroy himself. Then, just before dawn, a new sound. From the road outside, the dirt track that led to the house, the sound of vehicles, multiple vehicles, moving fast, and from those vehicles voices, commanding voices, Organized voices. The kind of voices that belong to people, or to things, that have arrived to impose order on a situation that has gotten out of hand. James's grandfather heard shouting. He heard what sounded like a struggle. He heard the shadow figures in the professor's room react, their commotion shifting from aggression to alarm. And then very quickly, very suddenly, silence. Total silence. The room next door was empty. The house was still. The yard was quiet. And when dawn broke and James's grandfather finally worked up the courage to speak to the professor, the old man simply sighed and said, "The patient I treated last night, the spirit afflicting him than I expected. It followed me home, and it brought reinforcements." He said it the way someone might say the weather had been bad, and that was all he ever said about it. Asar's tale too. The cloth by the pond, this one is even shorter and stranger. James's wife's grandfather, a man who lived to the age of 118, if local accounts are to be believed, told the story exactly once, late in life, reluctantly. When he was a young man, this grandfather was a farmer, not a prosperous one. The kind of farmer who grew what the land gave him and sold it at the weekly market in the nearest town, carrying his produce in a woven basket balanced on his head, walking several miles each way because there was no other option. One evening, walking home from the market in the failing light, he passed a large pond at the edge of the road. The pond was bordered by tall palmetto trees. And as he passed, he noticed something at the base of one of those trees. A pile of clothing. Fine clothing. Finer than anything he had ever owned or was likely to own. And from within the folds of that fabric, a light was emanating, not lamplight. A warm, golden luminescence that had no visible source and no apparent explanation. In the pond itself, partially visible through the reeds, a woman was bathing. He could not see her clearly. He did not try. But the clothing at the tree's base drew him. The fabric was extraordinary. The light was extraordinary. And he was a poor man walking home with an empty basket. He took the cloth. He folded it into his basket. He kept walking. Within minutes, he heard footsteps behind him, and a voice, a woman's voice. "Give me back my cloth. You do not want what comes with keeping it." He walked faster. "Give it back. If you return it now, I will teach you something. Something that will feed your family for the rest of your life. But if you keep it, you will regret it in ways you cannot imagine." He stopped. Something in the voice convinced him. Not fear, exactly, though fear was certainly part of it. Something closer to recognition. The understanding that whatever was speaking to him was offering a genuine transaction. And that the terms of the transaction, for once, were honest. He said, without turning around, "Fine." But the voice said, "Do not look at me. Keep walking. I will take what is mine from your basket." He felt the weight shift. The cloth was removed. And then the voice, still behind him, still unseen, began to speak. Rapidly, precisely, with the efficiency of someone who has limited time and a great deal to convey. It taught him medicine, not modern medicine. Plant medicine, the specific, practical, deeply detailed knowledge of which roots treat which ailments, which bark reduces which fevers, which combination of leaves and water and preparation method addresses, which conditions that the doctors of that era could not touch. By the time the voice finished, the footsteps behind him had stopped. He was alone on the road. The pond was far behind him, and his head was full of knowledge he had not possessed 10 minutes earlier. James told me that this grandfather went on to become one of the most sought-after herbalists in his region. People came from miles around. People with conditions that conventional treatment had failed, and he helped them, consistently, reliably, for decades. He never saw the woman. He never went back to the pond. And he never, for the rest of his extraordinarily long life, told anyone where the knowledge had come from, until the very end, when he told James, once, quietly, and then never mentioned it again. I've been thinking about both of these stories, and the thing that strikes me is how different they are in tone, one terrifying, one almost gentle, and yet how similar they are in what they ask of us. They ask us to accept that the world contains things we have not been introduced to, things that operate alongside us, parallel to us, occasionally intersecting with us in ways that are sometimes hot, sometimes generous, and almost always incomprehensible. The professor survived his night because he had spent a lifetime building the kind of spiritual discipline that functions as armor. The young farmer received a gift because he made a choice, a small, reluctant, not entirely voluntary choice, to give back something that was not his. Both stories end with the same unspoken instruction. Pay attention. Be honest. And when something older than you asks for respect, give it. Because the alternative, as every story in tonight's collection show you, is not something you want to find out about firsthand.